Jefferson Hall shimmered under a canopy of antique chandeliers, each droplet of glass catching the warm glow of the evening like suspended constellations. Diplomats, senators, and titans of Washington's corporate elite floated across its polished parquet floors, their laughter rising like delicate threads in a tapestry of orchestral sound. It was an evening crafted for elegance, calculated handshakes, whispered alliances, and curated smiles. But for Maya Roswell, it felt as if the whole world had narrowed into a single pair of hands resting at the small of her back. Richard Alden guided her effortlessly across the dance floor, his touch a blend of practiced restraint and unspoken possession. At 52, he carried his power the way other men carry their breath, naturally, without hesitation. His steel blue eyes remained fixed on her, reflecting not the room's grandeur, but the quiet, charged space that existed only between them. "You're luminous tonight," he murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear. "No one in this hall comes close." Maya allowed herself to meet his gaze, only briefly. It was dangerous how easily he could pull her into his orbit. She had told herself she wouldn't fall for the illusion again, the illusion that she mattered to him beyond stolen evenings and unspoken promises. But under the soft swell of violins, with the city's most powerful people swirling around them like distant ghosts, it was hard to remember the lines she'd vowed not to cross. The orchestra melted into a slower rhythm, deep and velvety, and Richard drew her closer, their bodies aligning with intimate precision. Maya felt the heat of him, the familiarity of the way his hand curved around her waist, the subtle breath he exhaled whenever he forgot about the audience around him. Tonight, though, something in him was different. He wasn't merely savoring the moment, he was claiming it, claiming her. "Maya," he whispered, brushing his thumb gently along her spine. "After tonight, things may shift. I want you to," but he never finished. A ripple moved through the hall, first a murmur, then the soft collapse of conversation, then silence so complete it seemed to inhale the music itself. One violin faltered, then another. The final notes died mid-phrase, suspended in the air like a held breath. Maya felt Richard's hand tense against her back. She turned. At the grand entrance stood Charlotte Alden, tall, regal, unmoving, a woman carved from calm marble and quiet storms. Her ivory gown glowed beneath the chandelier's halo, her posture impeccably still, her dark hair swept into a clean, elegant twist. She looked as though she had stepped out of a portrait and into the room, bringing with her a gravity that bent every gaze toward her. And she wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at Maya, their eyes locked, one pair cool and unblinking, the other wide with a sudden, slicing clarity, and the world seemed to tilt. Every soft lie Maya had allowed herself, every quiet compromise she had swallowed, every moment she had convinced herself she was in control, collapsed beneath the weight of that single look. She felt something cold unfurl inside her, something she recognized instinctively: truth. In that moment, amid diplomats frozen mid-step and senators caught halfway through their smiles, Maya understood the devastating simplicity of reality. She was not the mysterious force in Richard Alden's life. She was not the woman he had built futures around or pressed promises into. She was not even a chapter in his story. She was the conflict, the fracture, the betrayal. Charlotte's gaze held none of the rage Maya expected. Instead, it held understanding, ancient, sorrowful, and sharper than fury. The kind of understanding that came not from jealousy, but from experience. Richard finally exhaled, but Maya barely felt his hand slip from her back. Her entire body seemed suspended between two truths: the life she'd stepped into and the woman whose world she had stepped on. No one spoke. No one moved. Jefferson Hall, the proud jewel of Washington society, held its breath. And so did Maya Roswell. Even the chandelier light seemed to dim, as if the room itself bowed to the weight of Charlotte Alden's unspoken revelation. If you're enjoying this story's unfolding tension and layered characters, I'd love for you to like, comment, and follow the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful narratives like this to life. Morning arrives softly in Georgetown, slipping through gauzy curtains and spilling over the edges of Maya Roswell's bed like a reluctant confession. The city had not yet reached its full, frenetic hum. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rattled past cobblestone, and the distant rush of the Potomac moved like a low, steady breath beneath the waking streets. Her alarm did not wake her. The ache did. That small, familiar knot behind her ribs, the one that settled there after evenings with Richard, tightened as she blinked into consciousness. For a moment, she lay still, eyes fixed on the delicate crown molding of her bedroom ceiling, letting the events of the previous night blur into the warm darkness of memory. His hands, his voice, the way he leaned in, always just enough to feel inevitable. Maya exhaled slowly and turned her head toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dawn painted the sky in muted hues of lavender and pale gold. Washington Monument rose in the distance, a quiet monument to ideals she had built her career defending and interrogating in equal measure. And here she was, a senior policy strategist with Beacon Strategies, known on the Hill for her integrity, for her unflinching clarity in rooms full of obfuscation, lying alone in a bed that still carried the ghost of a married man's cologne. She closed her eyes as if the gesture could erase the contradiction. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She reached for it automatically, thumb scrolling through the notifications with the mechanical efficiency of habit. A push alert from a policy newsletter, a calendar reminder for a mid-morning briefing, several unread emails, and then the messages that always made that knot pull tighter. Richard Alden, 11:42 p.m. You left too quickly. I wasn't done with you. Another, sent just after midnight. Tomorrow will be complicated. I'll explain before the ball. Trust me. Trust me. She let the phone rest against her chest for a moment, the words thudding like a second heartbeat she could not quite claim as her own. Trust was a strange currency between them, lavish in its promises, threadbare in its structure. Maya sat up, gathering the sheet around her, and stared at her reflection in the mirrored closet doors. Her hair, a tumble of dark curls, fell around a face that the world described in words like poised, eloquent, formidable. Yet in this quiet hour, stripped of tailored suits and carefully measured language, she saw something else. A woman capable of dissecting complex legislation, yet unable to fully unravel the tangles she'd allowed in her own life. Enough, she whispered to herself, feet touching the cool hardwood floor. She spoke the word like a boundary, though she wasn't sure yet whether it was a promise or a plea. In the shower, steam turned the room to a soft blur. She leaned her forehead against the marble tile and let the water run over her shoulders, down the curve of her back, washing away the remnants of last night's perfume and his touch. She had told herself again and again that this was temporary, that she was in control, that she could keep her world separate. By the time she stepped out and wrapped herself in a thick white towel, her professional face had already begun to reassemble itself, piece by piece. Clarity, composure, distance. In the kitchen, the coffee maker hummed to life, filling the air with the dark, grounding scent of roasted beans. She moved through the morning routine with a kind of efficient grace born from years of early hearings and late-night drafting sessions. Pour, sip, skim headlines, mental triage of the day's battles. Beacon Strategies awaited her, her second home, her stage, her shield. She dressed in a tailored slate blue sheath dress, pairing it with a charcoal blazer that sharpened the line of her shoulders. The tanzanite necklace Richard had given her the week before, the one he'd insisted she wear to the Jefferson Hall ball, lay in its velvet box on the dresser, a sliver of ocean caught in stone. She did not put it on, and she slipped simple gold studs into her ears and fastened a thin, understated bracelet around her wrist. The kind of jewelry that said, "I am here to be listened to, not stared at." On the sidewalk outside, the crisp air snapped gently against her cheeks. Georgetown's historic facades watched her pass, their brick faces familiar and steady. She walked with purpose, heels tapping a confident rhythm, but the knot in her chest remained. Her worlds would collide today. She could feel it, even without knowing how. At Beacon, the glass doors parted with a whisper, and she stepped into a space that reflected the city's power back at itself. Steel lines, muted earth tones, walls lined with framed front pages and signed photos from senators, ambassadors, and CEOs. "Maya, morning," called the receptionist Malik with a warm smile. "Marcus is already in. Your first briefings moved to 9:30. Senator Alvarez's team requested you personally." "Of course they did," she replied lightly, her lips curving into the professional smile that never quite reached the place beneath her ribs. "Thank you for the heads up." She moved through the open plan office, collecting nods and greetings as naturally as breathing. Here she was not someone's secret. She was a name people whispered with respect in hallways, a strategist whose memos could shift the direction of negotiations behind closed doors. Jonas Park was already waiting outside her glass-walled office, a tablet tucked under his arm, his expression alert. "Morning," he said. "You've got a full plate." Alvarez wants a revised infrastructure brief. The European delegation moved up their call, and Asteria's policy team confirmed the 4 o'clock session. Richard's chief of staff sent over talking points. The name landed between them with a faint, invisible weight. "Richard." Maya took the tablet, scanning the schedule, feeling the familiar friction whenever her professional and personal maps overlapped. No one here knew the full truth of that intersection. She had told herself that was for the best. For them. For her. "Any red flags?" she asked. "Alvarez will push hard on environmental protections," Jonas replied. "Asteria's old position is incompatible with her new proposal. You'll be walking a tightrope." "I live on tightropes," Maya said, and this time her smile had a trace more honesty. When Jonas moved on, she stood at her office window for a moment, looking down at the street below. From here, the city's power looked almost abstract, little figures making big decisions, unaware of the invisible strings tugging at their hearts, their weaknesses, their private choices. She thought of Charlotte Alden. She had never met her. She had never spoken her name aloud outside of whispered, guilty questions inside her own mind. What kind of woman is she? Does she suspect? Would she look at me with hatred? Or with something worse, understanding? Maya pressed her fingers lightly to the glass, as if she could feel through it the lives and stories unfolding beyond her reach. She told herself, as she always did, that she was managing it, that she could hold both truths at once, the brilliant strategist who navigated policy with elegance, and the woman who stepped willingly into shadows with a man who did not belong to her. 2 lives, 1 city. One day that would, very soon, stop letting her pretend they could remain separate. Pressure announced itself not with shouting, but with a calendar notification. At 9:12 a.m., Maya's screen lit up with an update from Marcus Hale, CEO of Beacon Strategies. New, executive briefing, Asteria Holdings. Time, 2 p.m. Attendees, Marcus, Maya, General Counsel, Communications Lead. Her stomach tightened, though the reason was not immediately clear. Executive briefings were part of her world. She'd survived more than most. But something about the composition of that list, the presence of legal and communications, whispered of trouble waiting patiently behind polished conference room doors. She exhaled, smoothing a hand over the front of her dress, and pushed the thought aside. There were more immediate fires to manage. The Alvarez team arrived precisely on time, a sweep of aides and legislative staffers in navy suits and practical shoes, clutching binders and digital tablets like shields. They filled the small conference room with the faint scent of coffee and urgency. "Maya, thank you for fitting us in," said Amelia Cross, Alvarez's senior policy advisor, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she took a seat. "We're under the gun. The senator wants to finalize language on the transit modernization bill by Friday. We need something that can withstand Asteria's lobbying blitz and still hold up with the environmental caucus. So it began. The part of Maya's life that made sense. She moved through the conversation like a musician through a favorite score, listening first, then gently correcting, layering detail and nuance. She sketched pathways that balanced economic viability with equity, corporate interests with public accountability. Words and ideas became her instruments. She played them with quiet virtuosity. "You're assuming Asteria will oppose the emissions cap outright," she said, leaning forward, eyes steady on Amelia. "They won't. Not now. Not with their shareholder profile. They'll want flexibility, not absolutes. If you bake in a phased compliance option, you'll give them enough room to save face while still locking in the long-term standards you need." Amelia's brows lifted. "That could work." "It will," Maya replied, "if we phrase it correctly." They worked piece by piece, carving out language that could live in the ruthless light of hearings and press conferences. And with every sentence, every strategic concession, Maya felt that familiar, satisfying alignment. This is what I'm for. The irony was not lost on her. She was architecting constraints for the very company whose CEO had never once seriously considered placing even the smallest boundary around his own desires. By the time the Alvarez team departed, looking lighter than when they'd arrived, it was nearing noon. Jonas slipped into her office, closing the door behind him with his foot, 2 takeout containers balanced in his hands. "Bribery," he announced. "Spicy noodles from that place you pretend you don't like, but always finish." She allowed herself a smile. "You're learning." "I'm observant," he corrected, setting the food on the small table by her window. "And you get that look when you're running on caffeine and principle alone." "What look?" she asked, more amused and defensive. "The I can single-handedly redirect federal infrastructure policy, but I forgot my body is not a machine. Look," he said, unfastening his tie. "Eat." They sat by the window, the city spread below like a living diagram. For a few minutes, it almost felt simple. 2 colleagues sharing lunch in the quiet eye of the storm. "How bad is it?" Jonas asked between bites. "How bad is what?" Maya replied, focusing a little too intently on untangling noodles with her chopsticks. He watched her for a moment, his expression not unkind. "The Asteria pressure. Marcus hasn't said anything outright, but legal's been in his office more than usual. Their chief lobbyist has called twice this week. I'd be an idiot not to notice." Maya set her food down, appetite thinning. "Asteria is a big account," she said carefully. "They have every right to be nervous. The administration's shifting priorities, the Hill's tougher mood on corporate subsidies. It's natural." Jonas tilted his head. "And you're fine?" She met his gaze. "Why wouldn't I be?" He hesitated, then looked away. "Because they lean on you more than anyone else here. You've become the Asteria whisperer. When pressure builds on that side, it usually spills onto yours." He didn't say what else he might have suspected or noticed. The late-night calls she took in empty hallways, the way her tone changed when she said Richard's name, just slightly softer around the edges. "I can handle it," she said, and hoped the words were truer than they felt. After lunch, the day accelerated. A video call with a European delegation, translating domestic policy constraints into something legible across oceans and ideologies. A quick huddle with Beacon's communications team about messaging risks if the transit bill stalled. A briefing note from Marcus ahead of a TV appearance. Each task layered over the next, and yet, beneath the steady movement of her day, the 2 p.m. meeting pulsed like a quiet drumbeat. At 1:58, she straightened her blazer in the hallway outside Conference Room C, the one they reserved for sensitive discussions, which was the polite way of saying situations where reputation, money, or law hovered in precarious alignment. Marcus stood by the glass door, speaking in low tones with the firm's general counsel, Dana Lee, and the communications director, Patrick Monroe. They fell silent at her approach, not out of suspicion, but because her presence meant they could begin. "Maya," Marcus said, offering a brief, tight smile. "Come in. Close the door, please." She did, The room felt colder than it should have, the air conditioning humming an octave too low. Dana slid a printed document toward Marcus. Patrick had a legal pad open, pen poised. "What's going on?" Maya asked, taking her seat. Marcus folded his hands. "We received a call from Asteria's general counsel this morning, and then another from Richard's chief of staff. They're concerned." "About what?" she asked, though some part of her already understood. The knot behind her ribs pulled tight. "Perception," Dana answered. "They're nervous about being seen as too close to Beacon. They want to ensure we're maintaining appropriate professional distance in all aspects of the relationship." Patrick cleared his throat. "There are rumors, Maya. Not here," he added quickly, "but in their world. That's enough to trigger risk management." Rumors. The single word felt like someone had cracked the window and invited winter in. She kept her expression still. "Are they alleging misconduct?" "No," Dana said. "Not formally. They're phrasing it as a concern about conflicts of interest. They want reassurance that no personal relationships are influencing strategic recommendations." Marcus held her gaze. "I told them what I know to be true. Your work stands on its own. Our record with Asteria is impeccable. But this is Washington. Optics matter as much as facts." For a heartbeat, silence pressed against the conference room glass, separated from the bustling office outside by only a translucent pane and a gulf of unspoken truths. Maya felt two lives pressing against each other, no longer content to run parallel. "I understand," she said quietly. The strategist in her had seen this coming. The woman in her had refused to look. The afternoon light inched its way across Maya's office, sliding from the edge of her desk toward the framed degrees on the wall, as if even the sun were keeping time with her calendar. By 3:45, the sky above K Street had turned a softer shade of blue, the kind that made the glass towers look less like fortresses and more like mirrors. Maya stood at her window, arms folded loosely, watching people stream along the sidewalks far below. They looked small from here, staffers, lobbyists, lawyers, yet she knew how much weight their choices carried. A phrase added to a briefing, a comma moved in legislation, a conversation in a hallway. A rumor passed through the right mouth at the wrong time. She could still hear Marcus's voice from the meeting. "They're nervous. Optics matter. Rumors." He had not asked the question outright, but she had heard it in the careful way he'd phrased his concern. Had she allowed something personal to tangle with Beacon's professional obligations? Had she underestimated how quickly private choices become public leverage in a town built on whispers? A notification blinked at the corner of her screen. Asteria Holdings, Strategic Review Location, Beacon Strategies, Conference Room A, time, 4 p.m. Attendees, Richard Alden, Asteria Policy and Legal Team, Maya Roswell, Jonas Park. Her reflection in the glass looked composed, almost serene, but beneath that surface, something flickered. She reached for the tanzanite necklace box on her desk, fingertips tracing its velvet edge before she caught herself and withdrew her hand. "Not here, not now." "Maya?" Jonas's voice came from the doorway, measured and professional. "They just arrived. Marcus is greeting them. You ready?" She turned, her posture sliding into place like armor. "Always." He studied her for a brief second, as if searching for some sign of the storm beneath. Finding none, he nodded and stepped aside. The hallway leading to Conference Room A felt longer than usual. Through the glass wall, she saw them before she opened the door. Asteria's general counsel flipping through a folder, a senior VP checking his phone, a policy advisor arranging a neatly tabbed binder in front of her. And at the head of the table, half turned toward Marcus, stood Richard. He wore navy, not black, less severe, more approachable. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest long hours, not carelessness. When Maya entered, his eyes lifted immediately, as though he had been waiting for the precise moment she would appear. Something in the room shifted, imperceptible to anyone who did not know the language of glances. "Maya," Marcus said, gesturing, "you know everyone here." "Mr. Alden," she replied, voice steady, offering Richard the same professional nod she gave his team. "Counsel, good to see you all again." Richard's mouth curved, but only slightly. "We appreciate you making time on such a busy day." "We make time for clients who move infrastructure markets," she replied, taking her seat at the opposite end of the table. Opposite, a deliberate choice. The meeting began with numbers, projections, risk assessments, heat maps of congressional districts, public sentiment metrics. Maya spoke of trends and thresholds, of how far Asteria could push without drawing regulatory backlash, of what needed to be conceded gracefully before someone tried to take it by force. Her hands moved over the printed graphs, her voice smooth and precise. If anyone noticed the way Richard's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than warranted when she challenged a proposed line of messaging, they gave no sign. "Your current talking points lean too heavily on job creation," she said, pointing to a slide. "Voters have heard that promise from every corporation for 20 years. You need a more credible narrative, community resilience, long-term investment in neglected corridors, environmental stewardship that doesn't sound like an afterthought." Asteria's VP frowned. "That sounds like admitting we haven't done enough." "It sounds like recognizing that you're adjusting to a new reality," Maya replied. "People forgive history more easily than they forgive denial." Richard interlaced his fingers, contemplating her. "And if we adopt this framing," he asked, "what does that cost us?" Maya met his gaze across the table, ignoring the private language that lived beneath his words. "It costs you the illusion of control," she said, "but it buys you trust. And in this climate, that's worth more." A brief silence, then a low murmur of agreement around the table. Jonas added detail, pulling up data sets on the screen. Dana from Beacon's legal team chimed in with compliance safeguards. The conversation moved forward, weaving professional threads over a chasm of unspoken history. At one point, Richard shifted his attention to Senator Alvarez's pending bill. "You've been in contact with her team," he said. "Can we assume Beacon's guidance will keep our interests in mind?" The question was innocuous on its surface. Underneath, it brushed against the very thing Marcus had worried about: perception, proximity, impropriety. Maya answered without flinching. "Our guidance will keep the public interest in mind," she said. "Your interests are best served when you understand that." Marcus glanced at her, the corners of his eyes softening with something like respect. Asteria's counsel smiled thinly. "Diplomatic." "Honest," Maya corrected. The meeting ran long, spilling past the hour. As discussions wound down, assistants collected papers, devices chimed with new notifications, and chairs scraped lightly against the floor. One by one, Asteria's team drifted out into the hallway, followed by Beacon's legal and communications staff. Soon, only 3 remained: Marcus, already halfway out the door for his next call, Jonas, packing up his notes, and Richard, still seated, watching Maya with the patience of someone accustomed to getting the time he wanted. "Maya, you can walk them out?" Marcus asked, already backing away. "I've got the Alvarez follow-up." "Of course," she said. Jonas hesitated, sensing something in the air, then slung his bag over his shoulder. "I'll send you the revised deck," he murmured. "See you before you go." When the door closed behind him, the room felt larger. The distance between Maya and Richard both vast and dangerously small. He stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, the gesture unhurried. "You were sharper than usual today," he said lightly. "I'm almost afraid to ask what's on your mind." She gathered her papers with deliberate care. "Pressure tends to refine strategy." "Is that what we're calling it?" His tone was easy, but his eyes were searching. "Marcus looked tense earlier. Should I be worried?" "You should always be a little worried," she replied, refusing the invitation to slip back into familiar banter. "It keeps you from confusing power with invincibility." Richard stepped closer, not enough to break propriety, but enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the line at the corner of his mouth that appeared when he was truly frustrated. "Asteria's counsel spoke to Marcus this morning," she said quietly, before he could frame the narrative in his own terms. About conflicts of interest, about rumors. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rumors spread when people are jealous, he said, or threatened. Rumors spread when there's something to talk about, she countered. He regarded her for a long moment. Do you regret it? He asked softly. Any of it? The question slipped past her defenses more easily than it should have. For an instant, she saw not the CEO of Asteria, but the man who had rested his head on her lap in the muted light of her living room, speaking of his father's expectations, of the deals he'd made with himself long before he'd ever met her. Yes, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. And no. He moved one step closer. The glass wall at her back reflected them both, two figures suspended between the black and white world of policy and the blurred edges of something far more fragile. That's not an answer, he murmured. It's the only one I have, she replied. I regret hurting people who never consented to be part of this story. I don't regret knowing what I'm capable of feeling. Their eyes held. He reached into his jacket and drew out a small velvet box, identical to the one on her desk. Her breath caught before she could stop it. For tonight, he said, opening it just enough for the tanzanite to catch the light, blue, deep, and endless. I want you to wear it at Jefferson Hall. Her fingers curled at her sides. You're bringing your wife, she said quietly. Charlotte will be there, yes. His gaze didn't waver. So will senators, ambassadors, half the city. You will be announced as Beacon's lead strategist for Asteria. That's all they need to see. And what do you need to see? She asked. He smiled then, a smaller, sadder version of the smile she'd once fallen into too easily. I need to know you're where you belong, near me. She closed the lid of the box with a gentle click, not taking it from him. Where I belong, she said, is where my work speaks louder than speculation. He studied her, something like frustration sparking behind his gaze, mingled with admiration. Tonight will be complicated, he said finally, echoing his late-night text. But I'll explain before the ball starts. Trust me. The words hovered between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Maya stepped around him toward the door, fingers wrapped around her folder like a lifeline. Trust, she said softly, not looking back, is another currency this town spends too freely. She left him standing in the empty conference room, the unclaimed necklace glinting faintly in his hand, as the late afternoon light began to fade over Washington. The sky over Washington deepened carefully, as if it too understood that some evenings needed to arrive with ceremony. By the time Maya stepped out of the car in front of Jefferson Hall, dusk had settled into a soft navy, the first stars barely visible above the stately columns in floodlit stone. The building rose from the hill with the assured presence of long-standing institutions, places where history was not just displayed, but quietly decided. Flashes of cameras pulsed along the entrance steps, photographers calling the names of senators, ambassadors, and CEOs as they mounted the marble rise. Laughter and the low murmur of practiced charm floated in the cool air. Maya smoothed her hand down the side of her gown before she stepped forward. She had chosen it with the same deliberation she brought to her work. A column of deep emerald silk that fell fluidly from her shoulders, its lines clean, its drama quiet rather than loud. The color framed her warm brown skin in a way that felt like a statement without being a shout. A single slit revealed a measured length of leg when she walked, a reminder that power could be elegant, not rigid. Around her neck, the tanzanite stone rested just above her collarbone, a blue flame against green. She had hesitated. For a long time, she'd stood in front of her mirror back in Georgetown, the necklace lying on her palm like a question. It was beautiful, unquestionably so. It glittered with the kind of precision only wealth could purchase, the cut catching light and bending it into something almost unreal. It was also undeniably from him. In the end, she had fastened it in place not as a concession, but as a dare, to herself as much as to the night. Let it sit where it could be seen, she thought. Let the line between professional brilliance and private compromise shimmer in plain sight. Perhaps she was tired of pretending there was no risk to the story she'd let herself inhabit. "Name, please?" the event coordinator asked, her smile polished, tablet in hand. "Maya Roswell, Beacon Strategies." "Of course," the woman said, her smile warming. "You're at table 9, Asteria's table. Mr. Alden is already inside." Already inside. Somehow the words both steadied and unsettled her. She moved through the entrance, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The lobby opened into a reception area bathed in golden light, where guests clustered around high cocktail tables, their crystal glasses catching reflections of the gilded ceiling. A string quartet played from a balcony above, their music weaving seamlessly through the patterns of conversation. "Maya," the voice arrived from her left, smooth as a familiar chord. She turned. Richard Alden stood near a display of historic photographs, one hand in his pocket, the other cradling a glass of whiskey with the casual ownership of a man who had long ago learned he belonged wherever he stood. He wore a black tuxedo that fit as if it had been tailored to his posture rather than his measurements. The salt at his temples caught the light, lending his features a kind of distinguished sharpness. For a moment the room narrowed, the background softening around him. She inclined her head, keeping her voice level. "Mr. Alden." His gaze traveled briefly from her eyes to the line of her gown, then to the stone at her throat. Something almost like satisfaction passed through his expression. "You wore it," he said quietly. "It suited the dress," she replied. He took a slow breath, as if absorbing the sight of her was a process he did not want to rush. Then, dropping his voice just enough that it did not carry, he added, "You're the only person here who could make that necklace look understated." She should have deflected. Instead, she felt the smallest quiver of warmth in her chest, betrayal by her own body. "Careful," she murmured. "You're in a building full of diplomats. If you start exaggerating, someone might call for a vote." A hint of laughter touched his mouth. "Come," he said softly. "There are people who've been waiting to meet you." Waiting to meet her. Not the ghost in his shadow. Not the woman who lived at the corner of secrecy and convenience. The strategist whose name had begun to appear in briefings and op-eds. The one people quoted when they needed to understand which way the wind might turn. He offered his arm. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. This visible closeness was not their pattern. Their choreography, until now, had always been one of careful distance in public spaces. A glance from across a table, an extra beat in a handshake. Nothing that would draw attention from eyes trained to translate body language into headlines. Tonight, he seemed intent on rewriting that script. She let her hand rest lightly on his sleeve. Together, they entered the grand ballroom. Jefferson Hall's main chamber unfolded around them in a sweep of polished wood and candlelit brilliance. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, casting prismatic light across floor-length gowns and crisp tuxedos. The string quartet's music unfurled in graceful arcs over the dance floor, where a few early couples swayed like ghostly prototypes of the evening's coming spectacle. Richard guided her through the crowd with unforced ease, pausing to exchange greetings with a senator here, a media magnate there. Each time he spoke her name with casual emphasis. "This is Maya Roswell," he told Senator Alvarez, as if they had not spent the morning navigating each other's priorities through staffers and drafts. "She's the one who keeps your infrastructure dreams from collapsing under their own weight." Alvarez laughed. "Then I owe you more than a drink, Ms. Roswell." "She works with a much broader portfolio than just us," Richard added, his tone hovering between pride and possession. "But I like to imagine we're her favorite challenge." Maya smiled, offering the senator a handshake. "My favorite challenges are the ones that remember we're building for people, not just markets." It went like that for nearly an hour. Introductions, conversations, brief flashes of policy sparring disguised as social pleasantries. Richard stayed near her, closer than necessary, positioning himself as though they were a natural pairing. She caught more than one speculative glance from other guests, the quick glint of curiosity in practiced eyes. It felt like walking a knife's edge. At one point, Lila appeared across the room. Her friend, the journalist, dressed in sleek black, a press badge half hidden beneath an elegant shawl. Their eyes met, and Lila's widened just slightly as she took in the tableau. Richard at Maya's side, the tanzanite glinting at her throat, the unspoken claim in their proximity. Maya's stomach dipped. Later, she thought. I'll explain later. But later seemed to be dissolving into now at an alarming rate. The first official announcement of the evening echoed through the room, calling guests to take their seats. Speeches were given about the stewardship of democracy, the weight of responsibility, the promise of partnership. Polished phrases that both meant everything and almost nothing. Through it all, Maya felt suspended, a note held just beyond resolution. After dessert, when the first set of tables began to empty onto the edges of the dance floor, the orchestra shifted. The music deepened, strings thickening into a waltz, with enough grandeur to command attention. Standing beside her at the edge of the floor, Richard set down his glass. "Dance with me," he said. The words were simple, but the tone was not. "This is hardly subtle," she replied, arching a brow. "Half the city is in this room. Then half the city can see I value my strategist," he said smoothly. "It will do your reputation more good than harm." "Will it do yours the same?" she asked, the question out before she could soften it. A flicker crossed his face, wounded pride quickly masked. "Let me worry about that." She should have said no. Every instinct tuned to risk assessment, to optics and consequence, shouted at her to refuse, to hold the line he had blurred, to insist on distance until she could find a way to untangle herself from him completely. Instead, she heard herself answer, "One dance." He extended his hand, and she placed hers in it. As they moved on to the shining floor, conversations around them dimmed slightly, the way sound always seemed to bend around a focal point. She could feel the weight of eyes, the subtle recalibration of perception. Richard drew her close, not indecently, but with a familiarity that suggested history. His palms settled at the small of her back, warm through the silk. The orchestra swelled, and they began to turn, the hem of her gown whispering against his shoes with each step. "You're tense," he murmured. "You broken pattern," she replied. He smiled, but there was seriousness beneath it. "Patterns get broken when they no longer serve," he said. "I'm tired of pretending your presence in my life is incidental." She looked up at him, searching his face. "Incidental and appropriate aren't the same thing." "I didn't say appropriate," he answered quietly. "I said I'm tired of pretending." As they swept past the head table, Maya caught sight of a few faces watching them. A lobbyist who never missed a shift in the wind, a columnist whose words could tilt narratives overnight, a junior staffer whose admiration had always felt uncomfortably sincere. "This will make things harder," she said. "For whom?" he asked. She held his gaze. "For your wife, for me, for Beacon, for Asteria, for everyone who's built a version of you in their mind that doesn't have this." He exhaled, his fingers pressing slightly at her back as they turned. "You think I don't understand the cost?" he asked. "I've spent years calculating costs." "And yet you still do what you want," she said softly. The admission did not come with anger, so much as weary clarity. His steps didn't falter, but his eyes did shadow. "Tonight," he said almost under his breath, "I wanted to begin changing what I want." She wasn't sure what that meant. Whether it was another beautiful line, crafted to keep her orbiting, or some earnest recognition dawning too late. The music gathered itself toward its second refrain. They glided through a turn, her skirt fanning slightly, the chandelier's fractured light scattering over the floor. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to surrender to the movement. The familiarity of his lead, the hum of the orchestra in her bones, the sensation that, despite everything, they fit. Two minds, two bodies, moving in time with something larger than themselves. He leaned closer, his breath brushing her ear. "After this," he said, "I'm done hiding. I'll talk to Charlotte. I'll talk to the board. We'll restructure the narrative. You won't have to stand in the shadows anymore." The words, so long withheld, struck with the force of an open floodgate. Her chest tightened with a treacherous, aching hope. "You're making promises in a ballroom," she murmured. "That isn't where they hold weight." "Then let this be where I begin," he replied. She could feel the world shifting beneath her, the fault lines between what she knew and what she wanted pulling taut. Around them, couples spun and laughed, oblivious to the precipice under her feet. The orchestra swelled, violins rising in a luminous arc. Maya drew in a breath to respond, to tell him that beginnings built on endings had to be approached with more reverence than this. When somewhere behind her, she felt it. A pause. A disturbance in the subtle rhythm of the room, as if the air had changed directions. Richard's hand stiffened against her spine. And though the music still played, though their bodies still moved in time, a small, cold certainty slid down her spine like ice. Something had entered the room. Something that would not let their patterns break gently. The disturbance began at the edge of the room. A ripple at first, small, almost imperceptible, like the way water trembles before it breaks into waves. Maya felt it before she understood it. It was in the way the air thinned around them, the way conversation stuttered and faltered at the margins of her awareness. The orchestra played on for a few more measures, but something vital had shifted. The music no longer seemed to belong to the moment. It floated above it, disconnected, as though the players had not yet realized they were scoring a different scene than the one unfolding. Richard's palm went rigid against the small of her back. She turned her head just enough to see his face, and what she saw there stole the breath from her lungs. The change was subtle. He was too practiced to let shock fully surface, but it was unmistakable. His eyes had fixed on the ballroom entrance. Maya followed his gaze. Charlotte Alden stood beneath the archway, framed by marble and light. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though Jefferson Hall itself acknowledged her arrival. The chandelier's glow found her first, catching the delicate pearls at her ears, the faint sheen at the edge of her ivory silk gown. She did not move. She did not need to. Stillness itself became her entrance. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the way of glossy magazine spreads or curated social media images. Her beauty was the kind that had been lived into, shaped by years of watching, understanding, surviving. High cheekbones softly lit, a mouth set in a line that suggested both kindness and steel. Dark hair swept into a chignon so precise it looked effortless. Around the room, conversations died away, as if the hall had collectively remembered it possessed a history of solemn assemblies and had decided, in this instant, to become solemn once more. The orchestra faltered. First the cello missed its cue, then one of the violins dragged too long on a note that should have been graceful. The conductor's hands stilled, hesitation passing through him like static. The final notes collapsed into silence, leaving the ballroom suspended in a hush that felt almost sacred. Maya and Richard were still dancing, or rather, they were still holding the pose of a dance. Their hands touching, bodies close, but their movement had stilled without either of them deciding to stop. They were positioned almost in the center of the room, exposed from all angles, as if a spotlight had found them and refused to let go. Charlotte's eyes surveyed the ballroom with measured calm. Politicians, donors, ambassadors, old family names, a sea of faces flickering with surprise, curiosity, calculation. Her gaze glided past them all. For a moment it lingered on the head table where her place card sat waiting, a small rectangle of scripted ink marking the seat reserved for the woman of the man in the center of the room. Then, slowly, her eyes found Richard. If there was pain there, it did not show in any tremor of lip or tightening of brow. Whatever she felt, she held it with the discipline of someone who had learned, long ago, that certain emotions were too valuable to expose in public. Her gaze slid from him to Maya. It stayed there. The look was not what Maya expected. There was no open hatred, no theatrical outrage. Instead, Charlotte regarded her with a quiet, devastating clarity, as one might study a painting that explained a mystery better left unsolved. Maya's heartbeat thundered in her ears. For one wild moment, she wanted to disappear, to be anyone else, anywhere else, far from the polished floor and the weight of that gaze. She felt the tanzanite at her throat suddenly, unbearably heavy, like a confession carved into stone. The thought came unbidden, merciless. She knows, not as a guess, not as suspicion, as fact. Charlotte, Richard breathed, the name torn from him in something between disbelief and a plea. Maya felt his hand twitch against her back, as though he'd forgotten where it rested. He loosened his hold, fingers flexing in midair before falling to his side. For a moment, time stretched thin. It seemed to Maya that she stood at the center of a painting, a tableau of frozen faces, arrested gestures, crystal glasses hovering halfway to lips. The silence thickened until even the faint clink of a dropped fork at some distant table sounded like an intrusion. Then someone coughed. An aide shifted her weight. A senator cleared his throat. The spell splintered. Charlotte moved. Each step was deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. Her gown whispered against the floor in soft sighs, the ivory fabric catching and releasing light with each measured pace. Guests parted instinctively to make way for her, the crowd opening in a slow, involuntary corridor, like water drawing back from an approaching ship. Maya watched her approach, a kind of terrible awe unfurling within her. Here she was, the woman whose existence had always been a shadow at the edge of her choices. The wife, the unseen center, the one Maya had allowed herself to imagine as an abstraction, because abstractions were easier to live with than living, breathing people. She did not look abstract now. As she drew nearer, a few people attempted smiles. A board member, a philanthropist, someone's spouse reaching for social scripts like life rafts. Charlotte acknowledged none of them beyond the faintest inclination of her head. Her focus did not waver. Maya felt exposed in a way she had never experienced in a committee hearing, an on-the-record briefing, or a live interview. Those had always involved words, and words were her terrain. Here she had none, only choices. She lifted her chin, refusing to let shame curve her shoulders inward. Whatever she had done, whatever wrong she would have to face, she would not meet it as a coward. When Charlotte reached the edge of the dance floor, she paused for the briefest of moments, her gaze flicking once to the tanzanite at Maya's throat. A flicker, there and gone, passed through her eyes. Recognition, not of the stone itself, but of what it signified. She stopped at arm's length. "Richard," she said, and her voice was calm, cultured, perfectly modulated. The kind of voice that could host luncheons and negotiate with trustees and mask heartbreak in polite syllables. "I seem to have arrived in the middle of something." Around them, a few people exhaled nervously, the edges of the crowd fraying with restless energy. The orchestra's conductor glanced toward the event organizer, uncertain whether to attempt to restart the music. "Charlotte," Richard repeated, attempting to find footing. "I thought, your flight." "Yes," she said softly. "My flight. Plans do change." Her attention returned to Maya, and this time it did not leave. "You must be Miss Roswell," she said. Maya's throat felt dry, but her voice, when it came, sounded steady to her own ears. "Mrs. Alden," she replied. "It's an honor to finally meet you." The word honor tasted strange as it left her mouth. Too small for the moment, too ceremonial for the quiet devastation that hung in the air between them. Charlotte studied her with a level gaze, as though weighing not just the woman before her, but the choices that had led them both to this point. "I've heard your name often," she said. "Beacon speaks highly of you, as does my husband." The last 4 words carried no visible venom, and yet they seemed to land with the force of a verdict. Maya felt the heat in her cheeks, the prickle at the back of her neck. She could feel eyes on them from every angle: curiosity, pity, interest, hunger. Washington loved a spectacle dressed in civility. Richard cleared his throat, grasping for control. "Charlotte, this isn't..." She lifted one hand slightly, not touching him, but stopping him all the same. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not in front of all this." Her gaze slid briefly over the room, the politicians, the donors, the glittering facade of power balanced precariously on fragile personal truths. Then she looked back at Maya. "Miss Roswell," she said, her voice gentling not in volume, but in texture. "Would you take a moment with me? Somewhere quieter. I'd like to speak with you. Woman to woman." The phrase landed with a weight that was almost unbearable. Maya swallowed. She could refuse. She could insist there was nothing to discuss, hide behind protocol and professionalism. But there were some invitations that were not truly invitations at all. Some were summons. "Yes," Maya said. "Of course." Charlotte inclined her head, the faintest nod of acknowledgement, then turned toward the side of the room where tall French doors opened onto a terrace. The crowd parted again, less smoothly this time, the air alive with murmurs. Maya followed. As she walked away from the center of the ballroom, she felt Richard's presence behind her like a tether stretched to breaking. She did not look back. She did not reach for him. Whatever this was, whatever would happen next, it belonged to another kind of gravity entirely. They stepped toward the doors, toward the cool night air waiting beyond the glass, toward a conversation that would not be softened by chandeliers or strings. Behind them, the orchestra remained silent. The terrace doors parted with a soft sigh, and the night moved in to greet them. Cool air slipped over Maya's bare shoulders, rinsing away the concentrated warmth of the ballroom. Beyond the balustrade, Washington unfurled in a glittering mosaic, monuments and domes etched in silver against the dark. The Potomac, a quiet ribbon of reflected light. Music no longer reached them clearly here. Inside, the orchestra had begun again, their notes muted through glass, as if the ball had decided to pretend nothing had happened. Out here, pretense felt impossible. Charlotte walked ahead by a few steps, her gown brushing against the stone tiles in a sound like distant waves. She stopped near the edge of the terrace, where a pair of lanterns cast a soft, honeyed glow over the carved railing. For a moment, she simply rested her hands there, fingers splayed against the cool stone. Maya halted at a respectful distance. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but heavy with things unsaid. Up close, Charlotte looked both younger and older than Maya had imagined. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, not from smiling, Maya thought, but from years of narrowing them in concentration. There was a fullness to her mouth that hinted at laughter, perhaps freely given once upon a time, before it had been measured and weighed. "Beautiful view," Charlotte said at last, her tone almost conversational. "Yes," Maya replied, "it is." Charlotte's eyes drifted over the city lights. "It's funny," she murmured. "Events like this, the speeches, the quiet deals, the carefully choreographed photographs, all of it is meant to suggest that someone, somewhere, is in control." She straightened, turning to face Maya fully. "You know better than most that's rarely true." Maya held her gaze. "Control," she said, the word tasting of too many rooms, too many choices, is usually just a story we tell ourselves so we can tolerate uncertainty. Charlotte's mouth curved, just a little. Spoken like a strategist. A beat passed. Then Charlotte's eyes dropped to the stone at Maya's throat. The tanzanite caught the lantern light, burning a deep indigo blue. "May I?" Charlotte asked, her tone neither sharp nor falsely sweet. Maya's fingers rose instinctively to touch the pendant. "Of course." "I don't need to hold it," Charlotte said. "I know that design." Her gaze softened with something that, to Maya's surprise, was not anger but a quieter ache. "Richard has a fondness for rare stones, pieces that say something about how he likes to see himself. Unique, valuable, difficult to obtain." Maya forced herself not to flinch. "He gave me a similar one on our 15th anniversary, Charlotte continued. "Different cut, different setting. The same jeweler, though. I recognized his style immediately when you walked into the ballroom." Maya swallowed, shame and defensiveness warring inside her. "I didn't. He insisted I wear it for the event. You should have done many things differently, Charlotte said gently. So should I. So should he. We are well past the point where we can pretend otherwise. The honesty in her voice made it impossible to retreat behind practiced defenses. Charlotte studied her another long moment. How long, she asked quietly, between you and my husband? Maya could have lied. She could have minimized, deflected, claimed ambiguity. The instinct to protect herself flared, then extinguished. There were some women you could not lie to without losing something essential in yourself. 18 months, Maya said, almost to the day. Charlotte's eyes closed briefly, the faintest ripple crossing the otherwise still surface of her composure. When she opened them again, they were clear. Longer than I guessed, she said. You must be remarkable. The words were not flattering. They carried the weary weight of someone cataloging patterns. Remarkable is not the word I would use, Maya replied softly. Not for myself. Not in this. Oh, I don't mean it approvingly, Charlotte said, but there was no cruelty in her tone. I mean it statistically. There have been others. Most don't last past the novelty phase. 6 months, 9 at most. He gets bored, or they wake up, or both. The breath left Maya's lungs in a slow, painful exhale. She had suspected, of course. No one like Richard arrived at midlife with only one transgression. But hearing it, here, from the woman who had lived alongside those choices, was different. 20 years ago, Charlotte murmured, turning away to look at the city again, I was not so composed. Maya watched her profile, the way the lantern light traced the line of her jaw. I was 2 years into our marriage, Charlotte continued. I'd left a fellowship I loved because his father insisted the firm needed a proper lady by Richard's side. I was in love, and I was very good at convincing myself that sacrifice and destiny were interchangeable words. She paused, fingertips drumming lightly against the stone balustrade. When I found out about the first one, I cried in a bathroom at a charity dinner, very much like this. I remember staring at myself in the mirror and thinking, if I go back out there, smiling, I will become someone else. Someone I'm not sure I want to be. She turned back to Maya, her gaze searching. And yet, I walked out. I smiled. I made small talk with donors. I soothed a man who had broken something he did not even understand he possessed. Because I believed that if I held the pieces together hard enough, I could protect everything. Maya's throat tightened. Did it work? It worked, Charlotte said. For him, the words hung between them, stripped bare. For me, she added, it cost years, and a kind of quiet erosion, of anger I never allowed myself to fully feel, of dreams I told myself were childish to miss. Maya's eyes burned. I'm sorry, she managed. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, but they came from a place that was suddenly raw. Charlotte studied her face, as if measuring the sincerity of that apology against everything else. I don't say all this to invite your pity, she said, or your guilt, though I imagine you have plenty of that already. I say it because there is a script women like us are handed, and I played both roles now. The wife who forgives, the woman another wife imagines as a simple, selfish intrusion. Her mouth tightened, then relaxed. Reality is rarely that simple, is it? No, Maya whispered. It isn't. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rush of traffic and the faint, muffled swell of music from inside. Charlotte reached into her small clutch and withdrew a flat, white envelope. She turned it between her fingers, considering it, then offered it to Maya. I imagine you are wondering how long I've known, she said. Maya looked at the envelope, but did not take it yet. Yes, almost a year, Charlotte said. Richard has many gifts. Subtlety is not always one of them, nor is discretion. She tapped the envelope lightly. These are documentation, photographs, times, dates, a private investigator's work. You know the sorts of things men like my husband respond to when sentiment fails. Maya's hand shook as she accepted it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Why are you giving this to me? She asked. voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not giving it," Charlotte said. "I'm showing it." Maya opened the flap with careful fingers. Inside, glossy rectangles slid into her hand. She saw herself in the first one, getting out of a cab in front of her building, Richard close behind her, his hand at her back in a gesture that, to anyone unused to reading him, might have passed as courteous. The next image caught them laughing together in a dim restaurant corner. Another, his head bent toward hers in her own doorway. One more, too intimate, taken through the faint gap in her curtains, shadows and outlines unmistakable despite the respectful distance. The world tilted under her feet. "You hired someone to follow us," she said, though it came out more as acknowledgement than accusation. "I hired someone to confirm what I already knew," Charlotte replied. "I needed evidence. Not of your betrayal, Maya, of his." She let that distinction sit. "There's a prenuptial agreement," Charlotte continued after a moment. "It was drafted by his father's lawyers before we married. At the time, I didn't think much of the infidelity clause. I was in love. I never imagined I'd need it." She looked back out over the city, her face lit in profile. "In the event of adultery," she recited softly, as if reading from a document only she could see, "the unfaithful party forfeits an additional 40% of personal holdings beyond the standard division." Maya felt faint. 40% of Richard's assets. "Yes," Charlotte said, "of his shares, his personal investments, his future earnings tied to vesting structures. His father believed fear of financial loss would ensure fidelity where character might not." "And did it?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. Charlotte's laugh was quiet and without joy. "You've seen enough to know it did not. Men like Richard rarely believe the rules will actually be applied to them." She turned back to Maya, and for the first time that evening, her composure slipped. Not entirely, but enough for the pain beneath to become visible, like the shadow of a fracture under smooth skin. "When I first saw these," she said, gesturing to the photographs in Maya's hand, "I wanted to burn them, not to protect him, but to spare myself the indignity of such documentation. Then I realized I was protecting the wrong person again." Her voice thickened slightly, a thread loosening from a tightly woven fabric. "So I kept them. I went to my own counsel, not his. I began planning not a confrontation, but an exit." Maya swallowed hard. "The divorce filing," she whispered. He filed last month. I only found out tonight from a colleague mentioning something in passing." "Yes," Charlotte said, "at my insistence. He believed he could frame it as a mutual decision, two people growing apart, the usual language. He wanted to finalize the financial arrangements quickly before any complications surfaced." Maya understood. The timing, the increased calls about conflicts of interest, his urgency about her presence tonight. "He didn't tell you," Charlotte said softly. It was not a question. "No," Maya answered. "He did not." "I suspected as much," Charlotte replied. "He prefers to keep his narratives compartmentalized. It allows him to move without having to witness the full consequences." Maya's eyes stung. The photographs felt like they were burning her fingers. "I never meant to." She broke off, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. "There is no sentence that makes this better, is there?" "No," Charlotte said. "There isn't." She stepped closer, close enough now that Maya could see the faint sheen in her eyes, the way her breath hitched almost imperceptibly before she smoothed it away. "I did not ask to meet you tonight to humiliate you," she said. "If I wanted a scene, I would have made one in that ballroom. I asked you out here because I remember what it is to be standing where you are, suddenly seeing the full, brutal outline of a story you thought you understood." She paused, then added quietly, 20 years ago, no one gave me that mercy." Maya felt something inside her crumble and rearrange. "What do you want from me?" she asked. It was not defiant. It was honest. Charlotte considered her, head tilted slightly, as if weighing truths. "I want you," she said, voice low, "to stop allowing yourself to be used as a buffer between Richard and the consequences he has earned. I want you to see that whatever he promised you, it was never going to be what you deserved. Her gaze softened further. And I want you to know, she added, that while you are responsible for your part in this, you are not the architect of his character. He broke something long before he ever met you. A tear escaped down Maya's cheek before she could stop it. She let it fall. You're very calm, she whispered. More than I think I could ever be in your place. Charlotte, calm, she said, is often just grief that has finished burning and turned to ash. For a few moments they stood there in shared quiet, two women bound by a man, and by far more than him. Through the glass behind them, the ballroom gleamed, as if another universe entirely. Maya could see Richard near the doors, a step inside, held back by some combination of etiquette and fear. His eyes were on them. Charlotte followed her glance, then drew in a slow breath. He's watching, she said softly, probably terrified of what I might be telling you. What are you going to do? Maya asked. Charlotte's lips curved, the ghost of a smile without joy. What I should have done years ago. I will finish what I've started, secure my position on the board, ensure the terms of the prenup are honored, rebuild the parts of my life I allowed to orbit his. She looked at Maya with a kind of earned gentleness. And you, she said, will decide whether you want to be another woman who loses herself trying to keep him whole. The terrace door opened with a discreet click. Richard stepped out, the light from the ballroom framing him for an instant in the doorway. Charlotte, he began, his voice tight. Maya, the fragile seal of their private moment broke, but the truth it had contained did not vanish. It settled instead into the lines of Maya's spine, into the new edges of her understanding. She turned slightly, the envelope still in her hand, the city spread out behind her like a map of all the paths she had not yet walked. Charlotte, Richard repeated, as if saying her name might somehow reset the scene into something he could manage. Maya. He stepped fully onto the terrace, letting the door ease shut behind him. The sounds of the ballroom dimmed again, the muted swell of strings, the murmur of voices, until they were little more than a backdrop to the charged air between the three of them. For a moment, no one spoke. The lantern light caught the tension in his jaw, the slight strain at the corners of his eyes. Richard Alden, who could stride into congressional hearings and boardrooms with effortless command, suddenly looked like a man who had miscalculated in a game he believed he'd invented. Charlotte did not move away from the balustrade. She regarded him with the same composed stillness she'd shown in the doorway, though now, up close, there was a faint tremor in the line of her throat. It was not fear, it was restraint. Enjoying the evening? She asked, her tone almost pleasant. It was a question that in any other context would have been benign. Here, it landed like the softest of blades. Richard's gaze flicked from his wife to the white envelope in Maya's hand. His expression tightened. What did you show her? He demanded quietly. So many interesting places you choose to start, Charlotte replied. Out of all possible questions, that is your first. He took another step forward, lowering his voice further. This isn't the time or the place for truth, Charlotte interrupted. That's rarely convenient, I've found. His eyes hardened. Whatever stories you're spinning, they are not going to help anyone tonight, least of all you. Maya watched him, something inside her shifting into sharper focus. The cadence of his words, the calibrated concern, the way he folded self-interest into the guise of protection. It was all painfully familiar. Stories? She said quietly. Is that what you call them? Richard turned to her, and for a heartbeat, she saw something almost like hurt in his eyes. Maya, listen to me. Charlotte has her own agenda. She's positioning herself for the divorce settlement, for leverage with the board. She will say whatever she needs to say to what? Charlotte asked, her voice still calm. To protect myself from a man who has made deception into a profession? He shot her a sharp look. You dragged my colleague out of a ballroom to ambush her with photographs, he countered. That isn't protection, Charlotte. That's spectacle. Ambush? Maya repeated, the word catching in her chest. She looked down at the photographs again, at the captured angles of intimacy she had believed existed in a bubble of secrecy. They were suddenly unbearable in her hand. She slid them back into the envelope and closed it slowly, as though she were closing a door. "You hired someone to follow us," Richard said to Charlotte, his tone edging toward indignation. "To spy on your own husband." Charlotte's gaze did not waver. "I hired someone to gather evidence," she said, "because I learned long ago that my word carried less weight in certain rooms than a stranger's lens." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So you're using this to threaten me, to embarrass me into concessions." "Threaten you?" Charlotte echoed softly. "No, Richard, I am informing you. There is a difference. Threats suggest I might not follow through." The line landed with quiet precision. Maya watched the play of expressions across his face. Anger, calculation, a flash of something that might have been fear, quickly suppressed. He turned back to her, reaching out as though the physical distance between them could be bridged by sheer force of will. "Maya," he said, and there was that note in his voice again, the one that had persuaded, disarmed, seduced. "You know me. You know what this is. She's weaponizing your guilt to strengthen her bargaining position. That's what's happening here." Maya held his gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw past the charisma to the scaffolding beneath. Every conversation suddenly reassembled in her mind. Every half-explained absence, every postponed promise, every "not yet" dressed up as patience. "You filed for divorce last month," she said quietly. "When were you going to tell me?" He blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I was waiting for the right time," he said. "Tonight, actually, before she arrived. You saw that, you heard me." "You were waiting," Charlotte cut in, "for the paperwork to be sufficiently advanced that my options would be limited. You were hoping to finalize financial provisions while I still believed I was leaving a faithless marriage as an equal partner, not as the injured party with an ironclad clause in her favor." Richard's jaw clenched. "You're reading motives into things you don't understand." "Am I?" Charlotte asked. She reached into her clutch again, this time producing a slim folder. "Your counsel sent the draft settlement to mine 2 days ago. Do you remember the language you used when you reviewed it with me? Dignified, efficient, fair to everyone." Her eyes flicked briefly to Maya. "Everyone," she repeated softly. Maya felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between their three bodies. The noise from the ballroom was now a distant, meaningless hum. "You told me," she said to Richard, "that you weren't sure what the future would look like yet, that I needed to be patient, that you were figuring out how to hurt the fewest people." His attention snapped back to her. "I was trying to. This situation is complicated, Maya. There are reputations, shareholder confidence, legislative partners. We can't simply—" "You were trying," she interrupted, her voice steady and strangely calm, "to make sure you lost as little as possible. That's what you were trying to do." Something in him flared then. Not shame exactly, but frustration at being seen too clearly. "You're oversimplifying," he said. "You're letting emotion dictate how you read this. I've been protecting you, both of you. I didn't want a public storm. I didn't want Beacon dragged into—" "You've been protecting yourself," Charlotte said, "as you always have." The words were not venomous. They were simply true. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The argument he was reaching for seemed to wither in the face of their combined gaze. Maya felt the knot behind her ribs dissolve, not into relief, but into something cleaner, clarity. "Tell me something," she said, and her tone was gentle enough that, for a moment, he almost relaxed. "If she hadn't found out, if there were no photographs, no clause, no risk to your holdings, would you have still filed for divorce? Would you have left a marriage of decades? For me?" The question hung there, terrible in its simplicity. His silence answered before his words could. He hesitated. Not long, not dramatically, but long enough. "I care about you," he said at last. "You know that. What we had, she corrected softly. He looked stricken. Don't do that. Not like this. Maya, I was trying to find a way through that wouldn't destroy everything I built. The company, the foundation, the alliances. And where, she asked, in that architecture was I supposed to live? Exactly which corner of your empire was reserved for the woman you asked to wear your gifts in public, while you pretended I was just a name on a client roster? Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, as though the honesty of the question cost her something too. You're twisting this, Richard said, but the conviction was already bleeding from his voice. I needed time, that's all. Once the dust settled, time, Maya repeated. You've had 18 months of my time, 20 years of hers. How much more did you need to become the man you kept telling us you were on the verge of being? The lantern light flickered, casting his face in shifting half-shadow. In that wavering glow, the web he had spun, carefully, skillfully, for so long, began to show its worn strands. Little tears where one story no longer covered the next. Gaps where promises had been stretched too thin. Charlotte's hand tightened on the edge of the balustrade. He will tell you, she said quietly, that he can change, that this is the last time, that he is finally ready to be honest. He told me versions of that speech after each discovery. It is, I'm afraid, one of his greatest hits. Richard's eyes flashed. You're enjoying this, he said harshly, dragging us both into your performance of wounded dignity. Charlotte tilted her head, regarding him with a kind of sorrow. There it is, she murmured, the part of you that cannot stand to see women align in anything other than competition for your approval. The words struck him, and for once, he did not have an immediate reply. Maya looked at him, really looked, for the first time without the gauze of desire, of fascination, of flattery. She saw a man used to being the axis around which others revolved, suddenly unsteady when he realized the orbit was shifting without his consent. Richard, she said, and his name held no romantic residue now, only the weight of recognition. This is where I step out of your narrative. He stared at her, uncomprehending for a heartbeat. We can fix this, he said. You and I. No, she replied. You and I is what broke this. All of it. He reached for her hand, but she drew it back, the movement small and final. I won't be your secret buffer, she continued, voice low but firm. Not against her anger, not against your board, not against your own fear of losing what your father built. I won't be the woman who absorbs the damage so you can keep pretending you're merely complicated. His shoulders rose and fell in a tight breath. You're overreacting, he said, grasping for the argument that had worked so many times before. This is one crisis. It will pass. We've come through others. Don't throw away what we have because she's decided to. Maya almost laughed then, though there was nothing humorous in the sound. What we have, she said, is an arrangement built on lies you told her and truths you withheld from me. That isn't love, Richard. It's consumption. For a moment, the terrace was utterly still. Even the distant traffic seemed to hush. Charlotte watched her, something like fierce, quiet respect kindling in her eyes. I'm leaving, Maya said, more to herself than to either of them. I'll send your office a list of colleagues at Beacon who can handle Asteria's policy needs. There won't be a hole. Not one you can't explain away. He moved toward her again, desperation beginning to crack the polished surface of his composure. Maya, don't, she said softly. Please, don't make this uglier than it already is. She turned to Charlotte, meeting her gaze directly. I am sorry, she said, and this time the apology carried the full gravity of everything that had passed between them tonight. Not just for what I did, but for how long it took me to see beyond what I wanted. Charlotte's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. Then don't waste what you've learned, she replied. That's all any of us can do. Maya nodded once, the envelope still clutched in her hand like a weight and a warning. Without another word, she walked past Richard, past the door that led back into the ballroom's glittering world. As she reached for the handle, Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, necklace gleaming, eyes newly clear. Inside, the music swelled again. She stepped through, leaving the terrace and the web that had finally begun to unravel behind her. Dawn did not so much arrive as seep in, gray and hesitant, as if the morning itself were unsure it wanted to witness the aftermath. Maya lay awake long before the light reached her windows. Her eyes were open, fixed on the faint, shifting patterns the city cast on her bedroom ceiling. Every time she blinked, images from the night before flickered behind her lids. The halt of the orchestra, Charlotte framed in the doorway, the weight of the envelope in her hand, Richard's face when she stepped past him. Her phone lay on the nightstand, dark and heavy. She had turned it over sometime around 3 a.m. after the fifth call from an unknown number that did not need to be answered for her to know who it was. A faint ache pulsed behind her eyes. It was not just from lack of sleep. It was from the sudden, brutal rearrangement of how she understood herself. Not as the exception, not as the woman a powerful man might finally choose to treat differently, but as someone who had allowed herself to become a willing accomplice in someone else's pattern. She sat up slowly, feeling each muscle protest as if she'd run a race rather than danced a single interrupted waltz. On the dresser, the tanzanite necklace lay coiled like a question mark. She had unclasped it the moment she walked into her apartment, her fingers unsteady on the catch, the stone falling into her palm with a cold, traitorous weight. For a wild moment, she'd wanted to throw it off the balcony, watch it arc through air and vanish into the invisible currents of early morning traffic below. Instead, she had set it down carefully, almost reverently, not as something precious, as evidence of what she had accepted, of who she had allowed herself to be. She showered in water as hot as she could stand, letting it beat against the knots in her shoulders, trying to wash away the sheen of last night's glamour. When she emerged, she chose her clothes with uncharacteristic carelessness. Simple black trousers, a cream blouse, a navy blazer. No necklace, no earrings, nothing that sparkled. The mirror did not lie. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had passed through something and had not yet decided what to name it. Outside, the early rush had begun. Staffers with lanyards and coffee cups, joggers in reflective gear, delivery vans nosing their way through narrow streets. Georgetown's brick facades watched her progress, as they always did, impassive and dignified. The world, it seemed, was more than willing to move on without her. Beacon's glass doors slid open with their usual soft sigh. The lobby smelled of polished wood and espresso, the same as every other morning, and yet the air felt different, more charged, more attentive. Conversations that usually washed over her in waves seemed to catch and hitch when she walked past. A pair of junior associates, heads bent together near the cafe station, fell abruptly silent as she approached. Someone at reception glanced up, offered a quick, sympathetic smile that didn't quite make it to his eyes. Her heels clicked along the corridor like punctuation. "Morning, Maya." Malik's voice at the front desk was a shade too careful. "Marcus asked that you head straight to his office when you come in." "Did he say why?" she asked, though she already knew. Malik shook his head, but the look in his eyes said enough. She nodded, offering him a faint "thank you," and turned toward the executive wing. The walk was short, but each step felt weighted. She passed the framed front pages on the walls, headlines about major legislative wins, photos of Beacon partners shaking hands with officials and CEOs. She'd been in a few of those shots, standing just off-center, the strategist whose words had shaped the message long before the cameras arrived. Now she felt less like the architect and more like the structural weakness waiting to be discovered. Marcus's door was ajar. She knocked lightly anyway. "Come in," he called. His office looked as it always did, sleek, minimalist, large windows framing the city, a single framed photo of his family on the credenza, a scatter of documents on his desk. Dana, the general counsel, sat in one of the chairs opposite him, a legal pad balanced on her knee. She gave Maya a small nod as she entered. "Maya," Marcus said, standing briefly before gesturing to the remaining chair. Thank you for coming in early. She sat, smoothing her hands over her knees beneath the table, grateful for something to steady them. You've spoken with Asteria, she said quietly. His gaze flickered, just once, in a way that told her she had confirmed his suspicion that this would not need much preamble. I received 3 calls before 8 a.m., he replied. Their general counsel, their head of communications, and Richard himself. He did not disguise the slight distaste with which he said the last name. Dana glanced at her notes. They're not making formal allegations, she added. No accusations of improper influence. They're framing it as concern about entanglements that could complicate public perception. Rumors, Maya said softly. Yes, Marcus answered. And Washington, as we both know, treats rumor as preemptive evidence. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. Maya, I'm not going to insult you by pretending I don't understand adults make complicated choices in their personal lives. I'm also not going to pretend that those choices exist in a vacuum when one of the people involved runs a company that constitutes a quarter of our annual billings. The number landed between them like a stone dropped into water. I imagine, Maya said, that they want me removed from their account. Dana nodded. They used words like clean lines and institutional trust. Marcus's mouth twisted. Richard implied that there was a conflict of interest that might cloud your judgment on strategy. Maya let out a breath that sounded too much like a laugh. My judgment, she repeated, not his. We both know your work on Asteria has been exemplary, Marcus said. You have consistently pushed them further toward responsible practices than they were inclined to go on their own. Quite frankly, they would be in far worse shape with a yes woman in your chair. But that isn't what will make the evening news, she said, if it comes to that. His silence said he agreed. Did you? He hesitated, then continued with quieter care. Is there anything you want to tell me that I should know as your employer? As someone responsible for shielding the firm from collateral damage? It was the gentlest way he could have asked. Is it true? Maya looked at him, at Dana, at the city beyond the glass. Yes, she said. There was a relationship. It began after Beacon took on Asteria, not before. I never used my position to benefit him beyond what was already in Asteria's legitimate interest. But yes, it existed. Dana wrote something down in neat, swift strokes. Marcus's eyes closed for just a moment, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features. Not moral outrage, but the weary frustration of a man who had hoped one of his best people had not stepped into such a predictable bear trap. Thank you for being honest, he said. She almost flinched at the word. Honesty had, until last night, been the one thing she had still tried to reserve for herself. What happens now? She asked. Marcus glanced at Dana, then back at Maya. We have to make some moves, he said. Strategic ones. For the firm. For you. Dana cleared her throat. First, you'll be taken off the Asteria account, effective immediately. Jonas can handle the transition with our support. From a governance standpoint, we need to be able to say, clearly and truthfully, that your personal life no longer intersects with Asteria's business. Maya nodded. She had expected this. It still hurt more than she wanted to admit. Asteria's not just another logo on our website, Marcus added. You built that relationship. You shaped their public stance on infrastructure, on climate, on community. Losing that account entirely would be a blow to both our revenue and our reputation. And Richard knows that, Maya murmured. Oh, he knows, Marcus said. Which brings us to the second part. He hasn't pulled the account yet. He's strongly implied he'd prefer a fresh team dynamic. In other words, she said, me gone. In other words, Marcus agreed quietly, removing you from the entire firm would make his life easier. For now, I'm not giving him that satisfaction. Maya blinked, surprised. You're not asking me to resign? She asked. Marcus shook his head. I'm asking you to take a 2-week leave. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure what argument she'd been about to make. A pause, Dana said, to let the gossip cycle move on, to create distance between your name and anything Asteria-related, to give us space to manage the relationship without the added complication of your presence being read into every decision. It will look like punishment, Maya said, her voice low. It will look, Marcus replied, like prudence. Internally, I'll frame it as a sabbatical. You've been carrying 3 major portfolios for over a year. No one will question that you've earned a break. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Maya, who said, and there was a rare, unvarnished sincerity in his tone, "You are one of the sharpest minds in this city. I'm not interested in losing you because Richard Alden doesn't know how to live with the consequences of his own appetites. But I also can't pretend this will just evaporate if we do nothing. We steward our name here as carefully as we steward our clients." Her throat tightened. A week ago, she would have heard his words as affirmation, maybe even absolution. Now, they sounded like something else, something more difficult and more necessary, an invitation to responsibility. "I understand," she said, "all of it. Use the time," Dana added gently. "Rest, think. Put some financial and emotional insulation between yourself and this situation. You don't have to decide everything now, but you also don't have to stay frozen in it." Charlotte's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Don't waste what you've learned." Maya inhaled slowly, letting the air fill spaces in her chest she had kept hollow for too long. "I'll hand everything over to Jonas by the end of the day," she said, "and I'll be out of your way." "You won't be out of the way," Marcus corrected. "You'll be repositioning. There's a difference." He stood, signaling that the conversation, at least officially, was over. As Maya walked back toward her office, the murmur of voices seemed louder, as if someone had turned up the volume on the building's heartbeat. She could feel eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, some coolly evaluative. Jonas was waiting by her door, 2 coffees in hand. He took one look at her face and didn't bother with small talk. "They're taking you off Asteria," he said softly. "Yes." "And the leave?" "Yes." He exhaled through his teeth, anger flashing in his eyes. "You know you've done more to drag that company toward decency than anyone in their own building." "Apparently that's not the metric tonight's audience is using," she said, managing half a smile. He hesitated, then offered the second coffee. "Whatever you need, I'm here, even if it's just someone to say nothing with." The kindness almost undid her. "Thank you, Jonas," she said, taking the cup. Inside her office, she closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, allowing the weight of the morning to settle over her like a dark, heavy cloak. On her desk, the city shone faintly in the reflection of her computer screen. Her inbox was a grid of demands and deadlines. Her calendar, packed with color-coded commitments, looked suddenly like a map of a country she no longer fully belonged to. She set the envelope from Charlotte beside the Tanzanite necklace. 2 artifacts, one of who she had been willing to be for him, one of what that willingness had cost. Her career was bruised, but not broken. Her reputation was dented, but not beyond repair. The real fracture, she realized, ran somewhere deeper, between the woman who walked into Jefferson Hall believing she could keep her worlds neatly partitioned, and the woman who had walked out understanding that integrity was not a thing you could compartmentalize without losing its shape. She sank into her chair, opened a new document, and began typing a succinct, precise transition memo for Jonas. She wrote cleanly, clearly, as if each sentence were a plank in a bridge she was building away from the wreckage. Outside her window, the city moved on. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Maya began to envision a life that did not orbit anyone else's gravity. The first day of Maya's leave began without an alarm, without a schedule, without the relentless coordination of policy briefings and stakeholder calls. She woke to quiet, real quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of the trees outside her apartment window. It was strange, she thought, how the world could feel both gentle and merciless at once. She lay still for a few minutes, letting the silence settle into her bones. She had spent so long in motion, running between meetings, navigating crises, managing reputations, including her own. That stillness felt foreign, like an unfamiliar language she had to relearn. When she finally rose, the morning light was filtering through her sheer curtains, casting pale gold across the hardwood floor. She wrapped a robe around her body and padded barefoot into the living room. Georgetown's rooftops stretched beneath her windows, dignified and unbothered. Her phone lay where she had left it the night before, face down on the kitchen counter, deliberately ignored. She picked it up now, scrolling through notifications without opening most of them. 3 missed calls from Richard, 2 voicemails she deleted, unheard, a message from her mother, a quiet check-in from Jonas, and one from Lila, time-stamped just after midnight. "We need to talk when you're ready. No pressure. I'm here." Maya exhaled, her chest loosening. She typed a quick reply. "Give me today. Tomorrow, come by?" Lila's acknowledgement came within seconds, steady and warm. She set the phone aside and turned her attention to the apartment. Overnight, it had taken on the look of a place abandoned mid-thought. Folders stacked on the coffee table, her card holder half open beside a glass of water. The envelope from Charlotte and the tanzanite necklace resting together on the kitchen island like 2 conflicting confessions. She touched neither. Instead, she moved through her space with slow intention, opening windows to let the crisp air in, straightening cushions, making the bed with careful, grounding motions. It was a small ritual, but it centered her. Grief, she realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in the deliberate making of order where chaos had seeped in. By late morning, she pulled on jeans and a sweater and made her way down the street to a cafe she loved. One she had avoided during the affair because Richard sometimes passed nearby on the way to his office. She ordered herbal tea instead of coffee, craving something that soothed rather than sharpened. She chose a corner table, opened a notebook, and wrote a single line at the top. "What do I want? Not for him, not for Beacon, for me." At first, her pen hovered uncertainly. She was good at articulating other people's visions, translating corporate goals into public policy, turning abstracts into strategy. But turning inward was different. Vulnerable. Exposed. Slowly, she began to write. Fragments, at first. A life that is mine alone. Work that aligns with my values, not someone else's power. A future that doesn't require secrecy or sacrifice of self. Financial independence not tied to performance at the edge of burnout. Clarity, boundaries, agency. The page filled itself. When she finally paused, her tea had gone lukewarm. Maya closed the notebook, holding it against her chest for a moment, as though to press the words into her skin. Then she reached for her phone and searched her contacts for the number Tessa Monroe had given her months earlier. Tessa had always struck her as the kind of woman who had sculpted her life rather than inherited it. Razor-sharp financial mind, unflappable composure, a reputation for telling even the wealthiest clients truths they didn't want to hear. Richard had mentioned her once, in passing, calling her intimidating in the wrong ways. That alone had made Maya curious. She tapped the contact and texted, "Tessa, this is Maya Roswell. If your schedule allows, I'd like to set up a meeting this week. Personal financial planning. I need to restructure everything." The ellipsis felt honest. The prompt reply felt like a lifeline. "Wednesday at 10? My office. I'll clear the time. And Maya, bring everything. All documents, all accounts. Let's start from truth." Truth. A word she had begun to reclaim. The next 2 days unfolded with unexpected clarity. She gathered financial statements, investment summaries, banking records, things she had allowed to accumulate untouched while she'd been absorbed in Richard's orbit. She searched the top drawer of her dresser for the box of gifts she'd stored there. Earrings, a bracelet, the slim watch he'd given her 6 months into the affair. She set them all on her dining table and felt something inside her shift. Not guilt, not longing, resolution. She placed the tanzanite necklace beside the rest, completing the uncomfortable constellation of things she no longer wished to carry into the next version of her life. On Wednesday morning, she carried the entire collection, documents neatly organized in a leather portfolio, jewelry in a separate velvet pouch, to Tessa's office on Connecticut Avenue. The space was elegant and modern, all clean lines and warm wood, a place where numbers felt like they had been granted dignity. Tessa Monroe rose to greet her, hand extended, eyes bright with recognition. She was in her mid-40s, her presence both serene and formidable. "Maya," she said warmly, "I'm glad you came." They settled into low armchairs by a tall window overlooking DuPont Circle. The city moved steadily below them, unconcerned, impartial. "Before we begin," Tessa said, "I want to ask one thing. Are you ready for a financial life that exists entirely independent of anyone who has ever diminished your power, intentionally or not?" The question struck with gentle precision. "Yes," Maya answered, "I am." For the next 2 hours they reviewed her assets, her long-term goals, her risk tolerance, her career trajectory. Tessa took notes in graceful, looping handwriting. She asked questions that were both practical and piercing. What would you build if fear didn't speak first? How much of your ambition still belongs to someone else's expectations? If you step away from this city someday, what do you want to take with you? Maya answered honestly, sometimes painfully, and bit by bit, a new blueprint began to form. Then came the jewelry. Tessa opened the pouch, lifting each piece with a jeweler's cloth, her expression revealing nothing except professional concentration. "These are valuable," she said, "but value is only as useful as the freedom it buys. If you're ready, I can arrange discreet liquidation. The proceeds can seed an investment portfolio designed to grow without emotional entanglement." Maya nodded. "Do it." "Are you sure?" Tessa asked gently. "Once gone, they're gone." "That's the point," Maya said. "I don't keep altars to regret." Tessa smiled at that, pleased, not amused. "Good. Then let's build something better." By the time Maya left the office, the morning had brightened into a clean, invigorating sunlight. She felt lighter than she had in months, lighter even than she had felt in the early days of the affair before she knew what it would cost. This was a different kind of lightness, one born not of being chosen, but of choosing herself. She walked home instead of calling a car, letting the city thread itself around her in familiar patterns. She had built a life in these streets, a proud one, a tireless one. And now, finally, she was ready to rebuild it on different terms. When she reached her apartment, she set the empty jewelry pouch in a drawer and placed her notebook, the page with her list, on the desk. Not as a reminder of what she had lost, as a declaration of what she was reclaiming. A knock came at her door later that afternoon, soft but certain. "Maya," Lila's voice called. "It's me." She opened the door, and her friend stepped inside, scanning her face with a journalist's instinct and a friend's concern. "You okay?" Lila asked, arms already opening. Maya let herself be pulled into the embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of cocoa butter and lavender. Something in her chest loosened entirely. "I will be," Maya said, "for the first time in a long time. I think I will be." And as she sank onto the couch beside her friend, tea steaming between them, the late afternoon light turning gold against her windows, Maya understood the quiet truth of this new chapter. She was no longer mending herself for someone else's promises. She was building, patiently, deliberately, resolutely, a life that no longer depended on being anyone's secret hope or hidden disaster. A life that was hers, fully. 2 weeks into her leave, Maya had begun to rediscover the quiet rhythm of days that were not dictated by crises or Richard's unpredictable orbit. She had started reading again, novels she'd abandoned months ago, essays she'd bookmarked but never opened. She walked along the Potomac at sunrise, letting the mist cling to her skin, savoring the sensation of moving through the world unobserved. Her nights were gentler too. No late calls, no texts from blocked numbers, no need to brace herself for the gravity of someone else's choices. And yet, even peace has a pulse beneath it, a soft, silent waiting. Late one afternoon, as honey-colored light spilled across her living room, Maya's phone buzzed on the table. For a moment, she let it ring, savoring the last sip of her chamomile tea before glancing at the screen. Charlotte Alden. The name alone sent a quiet tide through her chest. Neither panic nor dread, but something deeper, more complex. Respect, caution, intrigue, she answered gently. Charlotte. Maya, came that steady, graceful voice, low, composed, and unmistakably on purpose. I hope I'm not calling at a poor time. No, Maya said. I'm here. A soft exhale, relief, or perhaps satisfaction. Good, because we need to meet. Maya's spine straightened. Is something wrong? Not wrong, Charlotte replied. Just changing. And as someone with a talent for reading the future of institutions, you deserve to hear about it directly. Her tone carried no menace, no bitterness. It simply carried weight, the weight of a woman who had learned to speak without apology. When? Maya asked. Tomorrow, Charlotte said. 3 o'clock, at my home. Maya blinked. Your home? Yes, things are in motion there, motions you should see for yourself. I'll send a car. And Maya, yes? This is not about Richard. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Then what is it about? Charlotte hesitated. Not long, but long enough that Maya sensed she was choosing her words with surgical precision. It's about what comes next, she said, for both of us. The following afternoon, the car Charlotte sent arrived 10 minutes early. A sleek black sedan with windows tinted against both heat and scrutiny. The driver greeted Maya with polite professionalism and navigated through the slow churn of Washington traffic with smooth, silent efficiency. When they reached the Alden residence, a stately building overlooking Sheridan Circle, the front entryway was open, boxes visible inside, art carefully wrapped in linen, the faint echo of change humming through the marble foyer. Charlotte met her at the door. She was wearing soft gray slacks and a pale silk blouse. No gown, no jewelry besides a thin wedding band she still hadn't removed. Her hair, usually elegantly sculpted, was pulled into a simple, low twist. If the ball had been her battlefield armor, then this was Charlotte stripped to her essentials. Still regal, still powerful, but human in a way Maya had never seen before. I wasn't expecting the packing to be so visible, Maya said, taking in the open boxes. That, Charlotte replied with a mild smile, is precisely why you needed to see it. She led Maya through the living room, now missing 3 paintings and 2 sculptures, gaps like newly healed wounds. They stopped at a table near the window, where documents were spread out in neat stacks, contracts, property settlements, corporate records, foundation agreements. The divorce, Maya realized, was no longer theoretical. It was happening in ink, in line items, in logistics. I'm moving to a smaller place downtown, Charlotte said. Something with less space and more autonomy. This house was never mine, only my responsibility. There was no bitterness, just truth delivered with practiced steadiness. And Richard? Maya asked. He's at the firm, she said, aggressively performing the role of the wrong party. He thrives on narrative control. He'll exhaust himself with it eventually. The comment was so precisely accurate that Maya almost smiled. Charlotte gestured to a long oak table where 2 chairs waited. Sit? We have business to discuss. Business. Maya felt a quiet ripple of concern, but she sat. Charlotte settled opposite her, folding her hands atop the documents. I'll be direct, she said. Blackwell Holdings is changing. The divorce has forced a restructuring, not just legally, but publicly. Richard's board allies are shaken. Investors are cautious. Confidence is recalibrating. She paused. And the board has asked me to assume a more active role. Quietly, at first, then formally. Maya blinked. You'll be on the board? In a voting capacity? Charlotte nodded. And in time, depending on outcomes, possibly in a position of greater influence. It took Maya a full second to register the implication. Charlotte was positioning herself not just as a surviving spouse, but as a future steward of the company Richard had believed was his birthright. "Congratulations," Maya said softly. "Truly." Charlotte accepted the words with a small incline of her head. "Thank you. I fought hard for this, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I will not rebuild my life on grounds someone else can pull from beneath me." Then her gaze sharpened. "And that brings us to you." Maya felt a slow tightening beneath her sternum, an instinctive bracing. Charlotte reached for a folder, sleek, navy, elegantly understated, and slid it toward her. Inside were documents bearing the Blackwell Foundation's letterhead. "I want you," Charlotte said, "as a strategic advisor." Maya looked up sharply. "Me?" "Yes. Charlotte, I'm not even sure I want to stay in this town. I've just stepped back from everything. I'm trying to rebuild a life that isn't built in Richard's shadow." "And that," Charlotte said, voice calm but firm, "is precisely why you must consider this." Maya's breath caught. "This is not a hire of pity," Charlotte continued. "You're brilliant, strategic, moral in ways Richard could never quite understand because your ethics aren't performative. You see people, you see institutions, you see consequences." Her gaze softened slightly. "And you have seen him, fully. Few ever do." Maya swallowed. "There would be conflict of interest issues," Charlotte nodded. "And we will build guardrails, explicit boundaries, no overlap with hysteria or governance related to Richard's remaining holdings. Your work would focus solely on the Foundation's expansion, policy strategy, civic partnership development, equitable grant structures." She tapped the papers gently. "In short, using your mind for something that leaves the world better, not just richer." Maya's pulse quickened. It was so tempting. Too tempting. "Charlotte," she said quietly, "I don't want to be part of a plan built on punishing him." A flicker, almost humor, touched Charlotte's expression. "Punishing Richard is an exhausting hobby. I have no interest in it." She leaned forward, her voice softening. "This is not about Richard. This is about capacity, about rebuilding with clarity, about two women refusing to let a man's failures dictate the scope of their own futures." Maya felt the words settle into her bones, warm and unsettling at once. "And the strings?" she asked. "You mentioned strings." "Yes," Charlotte did not hesitate. "You must be fully honest with yourself and with me. If you take this role, you cannot be half in and half out. You cannot disappear into guilt or distraction. You cannot let Richard pull you back into anything resembling that old dynamic, not professionally, not privately." Maya inhaled slowly, letting the air gather in her chest. "And if he tries?" she asked. Charlotte's voice was gentle, almost tender. "Then you will have a choice," she said, "and for once, it will be yours alone." The room went quiet. Maya looked down at the folder, its clean lines, its promise, its challenge. Then she looked up at Charlotte Alden, who regarded her not with judgment, but with a fierce, steady recognition. A recognition of someone who had rebuilt herself once. A recognition of someone who believed Maya could too. And in the quiet afternoon light of the dismantled Alden home, surrounded by the remnants of a life slowly being boxed away, Maya realized she was being offered something she had not expected. An opportunity not to escape her past, but to redefine her future. The morning of the Asteria board presentation arrived with the precise weight of a turning point. Quiet, inevitable, and threaded with a tension that hummed beneath Maya's skin like a distant current. She woke before dawn, long before her alarm, and stood at her window watching the city stir itself awake. Fog clung to the Potomac, softening its edges. The monuments rose pale and spectral in the first light, as if carved from memory rather than stone. This was her first return to the sphere of power since the fallout. Not as Richard's unseen shadow or Beacon's embattled asset, but as something else, someone else. Someone reclaiming herself. She dressed with the same deliberate grace she brought to strategy. A tailored slate dress, clean lines, understated jewelry, nothing that glittered, nothing that could be mistaken as a remnant of her old entanglement. Her hair, usually softened into waves, she pulled into a low, elegant knot. A woman arriving to rewrite a room did not need adornment. She simply needed clarity. The Asteria headquarters were a gleaming sculpture of steel and glass, rising over K Street, a statement of corporate strength, polished confidence, and old money disguised as modern ambition. As the town car approached the entrance, a familiar tug of memory pulled at her. She had walked through those doors countless times, always with purpose, often with pride, and for too long, with the quiet ache of blurred boundaries. Today, she walked through them with neither ache nor illusion. Jonas waited inside the lobby, a tablet tucked under his arm, his tie slightly askew, a sign he'd been up since dawn, preparing. When he saw Maya, his shoulders dropped in visible relief. "Thank God," he said, stepping toward her. "I've been praying you wouldn't cancel." "I said I'd come," she replied, her voice even, "and I keep my commitments." He nodded, swallowing emotion he didn't bother hiding. "You look ready." "I am," he exhaled. "Good, because they are already circling like hawks in there. Investors and board members, and Richard, of course." She felt the name pass over her like a cold shadow, but did not flinch. "Let's go." The boardroom was a kingdom of polished walnut and chrome, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she had served for years. The table gleamed like a ceremonial altar, every leather chair occupied. A dozen faces turned as she entered, some startled, some polite, some calculating. And then, inevitably, her gaze collided with Richard's. He sat near the head of the table, suit impeccable, expression carved into the facsimile of composure. But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with surprise, then relief, then something uncomfortably close to longing. Her heart did not respond. Behind her, Jonas set a slim folder in front of her seat. She murmured a thank you, then took her place at the far end of the table, deliberately distant, symbolically unaligned. The chairman cleared his throat. "We appreciate Beacon's attendance," he said, glancing between her and Jonas. "Given the circumstances of the last month, several concerns have arisen regarding our digital strategy rollout and the stability of the advisory team." A ripple of murmurs. Eyes cut toward Marcus, then toward Richard. Maya felt the weight shifting toward her. She rose before they could frame the narrative without her. "I'd like to address that," she said, her voice carrying with poised clarity. The room stilled. "I understand," she continued, "that my personal missteps created shadows over this partnership. That is mine to own, and I do own it. But I am not here today to defend my past. I am here to defend your future." A subtle shift, interest, cautious but genuine. She moved toward the screen, her heels soft against the carpet. "What Asteria is facing now," Maya said, "is not a crisis of public scandal. It is a crisis of relevance." The chairman leaned forward. Richard stiffened. Others exchanged glances. "This market is changing," she said, "faster than your current strategy accounts for. Your competitors have begun leveraging predictive modeling and automated policy alignment. Your public image is stagnating at the very moment the industry is accelerating." She clicked to the first slide. Asteria's brand perception charts plummeted in 3 key regions. "This," she said simply, "is where you are headed if you allow internal tensions to distract you from external realities." Murmurs deepened. A few board members frowned, not in resistance, but in recognition. Another slide. Maya's tone remained composed, her cadence measured and persuasive. "Jonas and I have outlined a strategy that will not only stabilize investor confidence, but position you at the forefront of sustainable infrastructure investment. Graphs, forecasts, partnership projections, digital transformation models, and then the cornerstone of her pitch. Asteria's future cannot hinge on individual personalities," she said, glancing briefly at Richard. "It must hinge on systems strong enough to withstand them." A few eyebrows lifted. Richard's breath caught invisible irritation. She continued without hesitation. "What we propose is not a rebranding," she said. "It is a rebuild. Quiet, efficient, foundation deep." She stepped away from the screen, letting the silence breathe. And if you execute this, she added softly, you will not just survive the next 5 years, you will shape them. For a long moment, the room was utterly still. Then the chairman leaned back, exhaling slowly. Ms. Roswell, he said, this is the most coherent and forward-looking strategy we've seen in 3 quarters. Another board member nodded. This is what Asteria needs, not another press cycle. Jonas practically glowed. Richard's jaw tightened. A man at the far end raised his hand. Ms. Roswell, I have one question. She inclined her head. Of course. Given the circumstances, he said carefully, what assurances can you offer this board that your objectivity and your commitment will remain uncompromised? The room held its breath. Even Richard looked up. Maya did not flinch. My objectivity has never been compromised, she said, but my boundaries were. That will not happen again. She let the truth in her voice steady itself. And to be clear, she added, I am not returning to Asteria's account after today. This presentation is a courtesy, a completion of my professional obligations before I step into new roles that do not intersect with this company. The shock was immediate. Richard's eyes widened, betrayal, surprise, and something like panic flickering through them. The chairman nodded slowly, absorbing the impact. You intend to exit Beacon's work with us entirely? Yes, Maya said. After today, Jonas will take the lead. He has my full confidence. Jonas swallowed hard, but nodded. Richard tried to interject. Maya, she did not look at him. I believe, she continued calmly, that a clean transition is in everyone's interest, including mine. A murmur of approval moved through the room. Professional, final, untangled. Richard sank back in his chair as if someone had cut a wire holding him upright. The chairman cleared his throat. In that case, he said, I propose we vote to adopt the strategic framework presented today. Hands rose across the table, quickly, decisively, unanimous. When the motion passed, a wave of quiet satisfaction swept the room. Papers shuffled. Suggestions rose. The crisis, once teetering, began to right itself. Maya remained still, letting the moment settle. Her redemption did not come as applause, nor as forgiveness, nor as a vindication. It came as acceptance, of her value, of her clarity, of her boundaries, of a chapter closed by her own hand. When she gathered her folder and stepped toward the door, Richard called her name once more. Maya, please. She paused, pivoted, and met his eyes. Not with longing, not with anger, just truth. Goodbye, Richard. And she walked out, her spine straight, her steps sure, her life, finally, her own to reclaim. 6 months later, winter had loosened its grip on Washington, and the city wore that brief, exquisite in-between. Bare branches traced against a pale blue sky, sunlight returning like a promise it had always meant to keep. Maya crossed Farragut Square with a steady stride, the cold air crisp against her cheeks, a portfolio tucked under one arm. The fountain in the center was still dry for the season, but children were already circling its stone edge, testing spring's boundaries. On the far corner, a street musician played a saxophone solo so soft it seemed to thread the air rather than cut it. She felt awake, not in the frantic, overstimulated way she'd once lived, running on caffeine, adrenaline, and the uncertain timetable of another person's attention, but in a quiet, grounded way. Her days had shape now. Her ambitions did too. Beacon's lobby doors opened for her with their familiar whisper. The receptionist greeted her not with curiosity or concern, but with the easy deference reserved for people who had earned a certain weight in the building. Good morning, Deputy Director Roswell, Malik said, warmth in his voice. Morning, Malik, she replied, and the title no longer felt like a costume she was trying on. It fit. The promotion had come 3 months earlier, the formal acknowledgement of what had already become reality after the Asteria presentation. She had stepped away from that account entirely, but her influence within Beacon had only grown. Her name now anchored internal memos on federal infrastructure strategy, digital equity initiatives, and long-term policy positioning. Younger staffers spoke her name with a mix of awe and aspiration. She was no one's secret anymore. She was a standard. In her office, the view of the city stretched wide and clear. No envelope sat accusingly on her desk. No jewelry glinted with questions. Instead, a neat stack of briefing packets waited beside a small framed note from Tessa Monroe. Every portfolio is a story about what you believe will grow. Make yours honest. Tessa's investment plan had turned Richard's gifts into something new. Seed capital for a future that owed nothing to him. Maya checked the morning's figures more out of discipline than anxiety. The numbers were stable, growing, like her. A knock at the door pulled her attention from the screen. "Come in," she called. Jonas stepped inside, tablet in hand, tie slightly loosened in his usual way. "Your 10 o'clock with the Federal Transit Commission is confirmed," he said, and Charlotte's team finalized the deck for the foundation session at 2. They're already in the shared drive. "How bad is it?" Maya asked, half smiling. He raised an eyebrow. "How bad is what?" "The latest attempt by certain stakeholders to pretend last year didn't happen," she said. He huffed a soft laugh. "On a scale from 1 to congressional hearing, maybe a 6. Richards lost 2 committee allies, 3 board votes, and 1 very patient ex-wife's silence. The inability to read a room is becoming expensive for him." Maya's expression sobered, though not with pity. "And Charlotte?" "Efficient," Jonas said, "and terrifying, in a good way. She's turned the foundation into the city's favorite philanthropic litmus test. Everyone wants to be seen in her orbit, preferably as more than a donor." He handed her his tablet. On the screen, a news feature. "From socialite to steward, how Charlotte Alden quietly redrew Asteria's moral map." Maya skimmed it. There was a photo of Charlotte in a charcoal suit, standing at a ribbon cutting for a community infrastructure project in Anacostia. No Richard at her side. Instead, neighborhood leaders flanked her, their smiles genuine, not performative. Maya felt a small, fierce satisfaction settle in her chest. The new power map was not subtle. It was simply different. Board committees now listed Charlotte's name next to strategy, ethics, and governance. Asteria's latest quarterly report gave equal page space to community engagement metrics and profit growth. The foundation's website featured initiatives Maya had helped design, grant programs for historically marginalized neighborhoods, technology access pilots, policy fellowship pipelines. All of it linked, indirectly but unmistakably, to the conversations she and Charlotte now shared regularly. They met twice a month, sometimes in Charlotte's new apartment, a light-filled space downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked chosen, not inherited, and sometimes in Beacon's smaller conference rooms, away from the main floor's buzz. Their dynamic had settled into something that refused easy labels. They were not friends in the casual, effortless sense. There was too much history, too many carefully held scars. But there was a mutual recognition between them now, a shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild from a fault line that had cracked through trust, pride, and identity. This afternoon's session at the foundation was one more strand in that steadily tightening weave. At 1:30, a car took Maya from Beacon to the foundation's renovated headquarters in Navy Yard. The building, once a nondescript office block, now bore a subtle plaque, the Alden Blackwell Foundation, the names in equal typeface for the first time. Inside, the lobby was airy and full of natural light. On the walls, photographs of completed projects, a restored bridge in a rural county, a broadband hub in a disinvested city corridor, a flood mitigation effort along a vulnerable coastal town. "Ms. Roswell," the receptionist greeted her. "Ms. Alden is in conference 2. Maya found Charlotte in a glass-walled room overlooking the river, a stack of folders open in front of her. She looked up as Maya entered, her expression brightening in a way that was still restrained, but undeniably genuine. "Maya," she said, "right on time." "I try not to keep board members waiting," Maya replied. "You," Charlotte answered, "are one of the few people in this town who could." They shared a small, wry smile. On the table, color-coded briefing packets bore titles like Digital Access in Dignity, Resilient Corridors Initiative, and Legacy and Accountability Framework. "You've been busy," Maya observed, taking a seat. Charlotte inclined her head. "When you spend 20 years learning how power operates, the question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge when you finally hold some of it yourself?" Her gaze softened. "I decided I was done using it to defend a man. I'd rather use it to defend an idea." "Which idea?" Maya asked quietly. "That we can build things," Charlotte said, "that do not require a woman to lose herself in the process." For a moment, their eyes held. The river glinted behind them, sunlight flickering like restless possibility. They worked for hours, refining program criteria, adjusting messaging language, mapping out partnerships that would outlast administrations and stock cycles. The ease between them was not light, but it was steady. They had learned how to disagree without defensiveness, to question without wounding. At one point, reviewing a slide contrasting old Asteria's philanthropic giving with the Foundation's new model, Charlotte leaned back, studying the two columns. "A year ago," she murmured, "every line item here would have been filtered through Richard's appetite for visibility. Now it's filtered through need," Maya said. "And scrutiny," Charlotte added. "Yours, mine, the board's, our grantees." She paused, then turned to Maya. "Do you regret taking this on?" she asked. "Advising me? Staying in proximity to the fallout?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I regret the path that brought me to you," she said, "but I don't regret where we are now." A faint relief crossed Charlotte's features, chased quickly by composure. "Good," she said. "I'd hate to think I drag you backward when you've worked so hard to move forward." "You didn't drag me anywhere," Maya replied. "You offered a direction. I chose to walk it." That distinction mattered. To both of them. As the meeting drew to a close, Charlotte organized her papers into precise stacks. The sun had lowered, painting the river in copper and rose. "Asteria's next annual meeting is in 3 weeks," she said. "The first since the divorce finalization. Richard will give his customary speech. The board has also asked that I deliver remarks. Brief ones, they insist," she added dryly. "Will you?" Maya asked. "Yes, and I want you to review my draft, not as a ghostwriter, as a compass." Maya hesitated. "That's a very delicate stage to step onto." Charlotte's smile was small but unmistakably real. "Delicacy," she said, "has never been your problem. Precision, yes, but not delicacy." Maya accepted the folder. "Send me the latest version. I'll give you notes by Monday." As she left the building, evening settling over the river, Maya felt the strange, steady satisfaction of watching an old constellation reorder itself. Richard still occupied a bright star on Asteria's map, but he no longer defined the sky. Others glowed now. Charlotte, deliberate and luminous, building legacy out of what had once been merely lifestyle. Board members who had once nodded along now asked harder questions. Communities that had been afterthoughts now stood at the center of PowerPoints and budgets. And Maya, walking along the waterfront with her coat open to the cool air, felt herself somewhere she had not expected to be. Not at the edge of power, hoping to be seen. Not at the center of someone else's drama, holding up the story, but at the hinge, the place where old narratives loosened and new ones took shape. She was no longer a complication in a powerful man's life. She was a force in her own right. And as the city lights flickered on, one by one, she realized that the map of power she had spent her career decoding had changed. Not because she had wished it so, or begged for it, or waited for permission. It had changed because she and Charlotte had quietly drawn new lines, and then walked them. The Smithsonian's Great Hall glowed like the inside of a lantern. High above, the vaulted ceiling gathered light and let it fall in amber pools across marble floors and silk gowns, tuxedos and glassware. The annual Spring Benefactors Gala was in full motion, Washington's elite moving in choreographed patterns, laughter and low conversation braided together over the murmur of a chamber orchestra. Maya arrived alone. She stepped through the great doors with the composed ease of a woman who was used to rooms like this now. Rooms where, 6 months before, she'd entered as someone else's secret. Tonight, every eye that turned toward her read only what was in front of them. Deputy Director of Beacon Strategies, advisor to the Alden Blackwell Foundation, one of the city's most quietly influential minds. Her gown was a deep, soft plum that matched the warmth of her skin, the fabric falling in uncomplicated lines. Her jewelry was minimal, small gold hoops, a slim bracelet. Her neck was bare. She had not worn a necklace in months. The party unfolded around her in luminous detail. Donors leaned in to hear curators talk about new acquisitions. A senator she'd once briefed nodded to her from across the room. A junior analyst from Beacon almost spilled his drink when she greeted him by name. It all felt steady, not intoxicating, not dizzying, steady, as if the ground beneath her had finally stopped shifting. Miss Roswell, she turned to find the museum director at her elbow, smiling warmly. We're honored you could join us. Your work with the Foundation's educational grants has made this year's programming possible. The honor's mutual, Maya replied, meaning it. This is the kind of influence that makes the rest of it tolerable. From the corner of her eye, she caught a flash of familiar silver at the temples, an angle of jaw she knew too well. Her body registered it before her mind did, a brief tightening in her chest, a prickle at the back of her neck. She did not turn immediately. She finished the conversation with the director, accepted a flute of champagne from a passing tray, and moved toward the edge of the hall, where Renaissance portraits watched everything with timeless, uninterested eyes. Only then did she let herself acknowledge what she already knew. Vivian, among the masters, came a voice that still knew how to find the cracks in her defenses, though it no longer owned them. I should have guessed. She faced him. Richard Alden stood framed by a marble archway, tuxedo immaculate, posture relaxed in a way that was anything but. Up close, the changes were clearer than any gossip column could have captured. The faint deepening of the lines around his mouth, a tightness at the jaw, a tiredness in the eyes that had nothing to do with age. He looked contained. Not in control, not exactly. Contained. Like a man who had begun to understand the limits of his reach. Richard, she said, the name simple now, stripped of every old inflection. I didn't know you'd be here. Alden Blackwell still funds wings in exhibits, he replied, even if the board has decided the shine looks better when reflected off other faces. His tone was lighter than his eyes. Maya let the comment pass. How are you? She asked. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. Professionally, busy. Personally, divorced. His gaze sharpened. You've heard, I imagine. I have, she said, from reliable sources. The most reliable, he murmured, glancing briefly around the hall, as if expecting Charlotte to materialize near any philanthropic decision of significance. As if summoned, Maya caught sight of her across the room, deep in conversation with a cluster of trustees. Charlotte wore dark green tonight, her hair swept back, a diamond at her throat that caught the light without shouting. She looked assured in a way that no one who had not lost something could ever quite manage. Charlotte met Maya's eyes briefly, inclining her head. There was no shock in her expression at seeing Maya and Richard in the same frame, only a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. Richard followed Maya's gaze, then looked back at her. She's thriving, he said. My punishment, I suppose. It's not punishment, Maya replied. It's what happens when someone stops living in the parentheses of your life. He flinched, very slightly. A passing couple laughed nearby. A server brushed by with a tray of canapes. The moment stood apart from the rest of the evening, an island of older currents in a new tide. Maya, Richard said softly, could we talk? Somewhere less curated? Once, the request would have sent her heart racing. Once, she would have followed its pull without question, mistaking urgency for depth. Now she waited. We're talking, she pointed out gently. He exhaled, frustration threading through the sound. You know what I mean. 5 minutes. I won't ask for more. She regarded him for a long moment. Fine, she said. The portrait gallery. It's quiet. They moved side by side through the archway into a smaller room lined with oil paintings. Noblemen, merchants, women in lace and pearls watched from their frames, their painted eyes capturing centuries of ambition, vanity, regret. It felt appropriate. Richard stopped in the center of the room, turning to face her fully. I've been trying for months to get you to speak to me, he said. You've been difficult to catch. I've been busy living my life, she replied. The two are not the same. His mouth tightened. What we had is over, she said, not unkindly. We ended it on a terrace overlooking the city, if you recall. That wasn't an ending, he insisted. It was an explosion. Endings can be reconsidered. Maya almost laughed. You're still very good at telling yourself stories. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but certainly testing its edges. Maya, listen to me. I've changed. She tilted her head. Have you? I signed over shares I never thought I'd part with, he said, something raw entering his voice. I surrendered control to a board that now questions my every move. I watched my ex-wife and my former strategist redesign the moral architecture of my company while I tried to keep up. If that doesn't change a man, she held up a hand, stopping him. Those are things that happen to you, she said quietly, not things you chose. I'm not saying you're incapable of change. I'm saying you don't get to hold consequences up as proof of character you only found afterward. He blinked, thrown off balance. Maya. His voice roughened her name the way it always had. There was still something in it that knew how to reach for her. But the reach no longer landed in a place she had left open. I miss you, he said simply. There it was. No strategy, no dressing, just a confession. She let it sit between them for a few seconds. I believe you, she replied. Hope flickered in his eyes. Then maybe believing you miss me, she continued gently, doesn't obligate me to go back to the person I was when you had me. Silence. He looked as if he'd taken a step forward, only to find the floor had moved. Do you ever think about it? He asked. About us? About what might have been if you'd been someone else sooner, she finished. If you'd told the truth before you were forced to. If we'd built something that didn't require someone else's heart as collateral. His jaw clenched. Yes. She smiled then, small but real. No, she said. I don't. He stared at her, disbelieving. You're lying, he said, but there was no conviction in it, only habit. I think about what I learned, she said, about who I don't ever want to be again, about lines I won't cross, even for brilliance and charm, in the illusion of being chosen. She glanced back toward the great hall, where the music had swelled into something bright and expansive. I think about women, she added softly, who are still in the middle of stories like ours, telling themselves that if they just hold on a little longer, he'll finally become the man his potential keeps promising. She looked at him again. And I hope they don't wait as long as I did to walk away. Richard swallowed, throat working. I loved you, he said quietly, as if unveiling some final, unspent truth. Maya's eyes softened. I believe you, she said again, but your love asked me to shrink to fit the space you'd made for me in your life. Mine now asked me to expand. He searched her face, maybe hoping to find some trace of the old susceptibility. You've become cruel, he said at last, but even as he said it, his gaze belied the words. There was respect there. Fear, perhaps, but not disdain. No, she said, I've become accurate. They stood there, two figures among the painted ghosts of older lives, older entanglements. From the doorway, a soft sound, footsteps, the rustle of fabric. Charlotte's reflection appeared in the glass of a framed portrait before she stepped fully into view. Ah, she said mildly, so this is where the past has gone to haunt itself. Richard's expression tightened. Charlotte. Richard. She inclined her head, then turned to Maya. The curator is about to begin the private tour of the new exhibit. They were hoping you'd join the group. Maya caught the extrication for what it was and appreciated the care beneath the composure. Of course, she said. I'll come. Charlotte's gaze flicked briefly between them, reading a room the way only someone who had once lived inside its storms could. No raised voices, she observed lightly. No shattered glass. How wonderfully modern. Richard looked as if he wanted to protest something, but the words tangled. Maya stepped past him, offering a final acknowledgement. Take care of yourself, Richard, she said. Truly. He opened his mouth, whether to argue or plead, she didn't know. But the moment had already closed. She walked toward Charlotte, who fell into step beside her. As they moved back into the great hall, the swell of music wrapped around them, bright and indifferent. You handled that well, Charlotte murmured. Maya exhaled slowly. I handled it truthfully, which, Charlotte said, is often the same thing. They joined the small group gathering around the curator, who began speaking about brushstrokes and symbolism, about the way artists of another century had tried to capture the complexity of human faces in layers of paint and light. Maya listened, the words washing over her, her mind oddly quiet. Behind her, somewhere in the portrait gallery, a man she had once rearranged her life around stood alone, dwarfed by the silent scrutiny of lives frozen in oil and gilded frames. Ahead of her, voices spoke of new acquisitions, new projects, new collaborations. She chose, without hesitation, to walk toward them. Spring did not announce itself that year. It unfolded quietly, like a decision made in the soul long before the mind could name it. On a Sunday morning in May, Maya stood at her window, barefoot, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Georgetown shimmered beneath a sky so clear it felt newly laundered. Brick facades, trees in tender green, the Potomac glinting like a ribbon of liquid light. Her phone lay on the dining table behind her, screen awake, an email open. Subject line, offer, Global Policy Innovation Fellowship, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Nairobi. 6 months ago, that subject would have sent her spiraling into calculations. How would Asteria react? Could Richard manage without her? Would Beacon survive the optics? Could she really step away from the city that had become both her proving ground and her prison? Now, none of those questions appeared. She'd read the email twice already. A consortium of international think tanks and foundations, Tessa had quietly recommended her, wanted her to lead a rotating fellowship on equitable infrastructure and digital access. A year abroad split across 3 cities, full autonomy, full support, a chance to shape policy where the stakes were not only financial, but deeply human. The offer did not feel like an escape. It felt like a continuation. Her life in Washington was no longer something she needed to run from. It was something she could step away from without fear of it collapsing in her absence. Beacon was steady with Jonas and the newly promoted team. The foundation was in capable hands. Charlotte had blossomed into the kind of leader who needed no one's shadow to lend her shape. They would all move forward. And so would she. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Charlotte. If you go, we'll miss you. If you stay because of us, I'll never forgive you. Choose the horizon that feels like breath, not obligation. Maya smiled, the words settling deep. Another message pinged in, this one from Tessa. Say yes. The world is larger than this river and this town. You're ready. She walked back to the table, set down her mug, and rested both hands on either side of the laptop. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She remembered the ballroom at Jefferson Hall, the terrace, the photographs, the awful, clarifying pain. She remembered the first time she'd sat across from Charlotte, not as an adversary, but as a woman who knew what it meant to lose herself and refuse to stay lost. She remembered staring at her notebook in the cafe, writing the words, "What do I want?" Not for him, not for Beacon, for me. And now, here it was. The question returning, not as an accusation, but as an open door. Maya opened her eyes and typed a single line in reply to the fellowship committee. I accept. She hit send. The moment didn't explode, it unfolded. a quiet, steady widening of the world inside her chest. The decision did not erase what had been. It placed it, gave it context, made it prologue instead of prison. Her future would not be defined by the fact that she had once been a powerful man's secret. It would be defined by the fact that she had refused to remain so, that she had chosen, again and again, to move toward wholeness instead of comfort, truth instead of flattery, expansion instead of orbit. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "You're really doing this? Proud of you. Terrified for us, but mostly proud." She laughed, eyes stinging. "Charlotte, good. Send photos from every city. And remember, don't build a life you'd be ashamed to narrate out loud." Later that night, she walked along the river one last time before everything changed. The city hummed around her. Sirens in the distance, murmurs from restaurant patios, couples crossing Key Bridge hand in hand. The monuments glowed like soft intentions against the dark. She paused at the water's edge, the cool breeze lifting her hair. There had been a time when she'd believed love meant contorting herself to fit someone else's story, when power had seemed like something bestowed by a mentor, a firm, a lover. Now she understood. Power could be reclaimed. Narratives could be rewritten. And love, when it came again, as she believed it someday would have to meet her where she truly stood. Not in shadow, not in halves, but in the full brightness of a life she had chosen. She tilted her face to the wind. Somewhere beyond this river, other cities awaited, other decisions, other women, perhaps, standing where she had stood, wondering if they were allowed to walk away from the wrong kind of devotion. She hoped, fiercely, that they would, and that in some small way, the work she was going to do, the policies she'd shape, the voices she'd amplify, the structures she'd help unmake and rebuild, would make that choice a little easier for them. The mistress had once danced first, in borrowed light. Now the woman she had become walked forward to her own music, no longer defined by the men who had underestimated her, but by the courage it took to stop letting them. She turned from the river and headed home, already imagining the sound of new streets, new languages, new rooms where her name would mean only what she chose to make of it. Her future was not waiting for her. She was going to meet it. If Maya's journey, from secrecy to self-worth, from orbit to ownership, moved you, I'd love for you to like, comment, and follow. Share your favorite moment, the line that stayed with you, or the choice you're ready to make in your own life. Your support helps bring more layered, emotionally rich stories like this into the world.